Scientists keep finding ancient artifacts that should not exist, objects older than civilization itself. How did impossible precision carvings appear in stone untouched by known tools? And why do some ruins defy every timeline humanity trusts? Each discovery deepens the mystery, and something about it feels deliberately hidden. No answers yet. Rising abruptly from the forested landscape of the Teutoburg Hills in northern Germany, the Externsteine appear almost out of place. Towering sandstone pillars carved not by human hands, but by millions of years of water, wind, and shifting earth. Narrow and jagged, they stand like a broken spine of stone, stretching upward in uneven sequence, their surfaces marked with hollows, ledges, and steep vertical faces that catch light differently as the day moves. Mist often lingers at their base, softening their outlines and adding to the sense that they are less a geological formation than something placed or arranged with intention. Geologically, the formation is understood as natural. Layers of sandstone were gradually shaped by erosion, uplift, and the slow work of time. Yet even this explanation does not diminish the impression they leave. Why here, of all places, do these stones rise so dramatically from relatively gentle terrain? And why do they seem to form a deliberate architectural rhythm when viewed from a distance? Historical records begin to speak more clearly in the medieval period. By the early Middle Ages, the Externsteine were already known to local populations. In the 12th century, a monastic presence was established nearby, and parts of the rock were adapted for religious use. The most famous feature is a carved relief known as the Descent from the Cross, cut directly into the stone wall. It depicts a biblical scene attributed to medieval Christian artisans, and is often cited as evidence that the site was integrated into Christian worship rather than standing outside it. Above and around this relief are chambers, stairways, and platforms carved into the rock. One of the most enigmatic is a small cave-like space known as the grotto, connected by narrow passages that feel almost deliberate in their constraint. From higher points, the view opens across the surrounding forest, as if the entire formation was both a lookout and a place of gathering. And yet, interpretations of the Externsteine extend far beyond the medieval monastic record. Some historians and archaeologists have suggested that the site may have held significance long before Christian influence arrived. Theories propose that it could have been a pre-Christian sacred site for Germanic tribes, possibly used for ritual gatherings aligned with seasonal cycles. There is no definitive archaeological proof of such usage, but the idea persists, supported in part by the natural prominence of the formation and its commanding presence in the landscape. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, interest in ancient Germanic heritage led to more speculative interpretations. Some writers proposed that the Externsteine functioned as an astronomical observatory, its openings and angles aligned with solar events such as solstices. Others, particularly in esoteric traditions, suggested the stones were part of a wider network of Earth energy points, places where natural forces were believed to converge. These ideas remain outside mainstream archaeology, yet they continue to attract attention precisely because the site itself feels resistant to simple explanation. During the 20th century, the formation also became entangled in ideological reinterpretations, where attempts were made to frame it as a central monument of imagined ancient traditions. Modern scholarship, however, largely separates these later narratives from the physical evidence, emphasizing the need to distinguish between cultural projection and verifiable history. Still, even when stripped of speculation, the Externsteine retain an unusual quality. The way light enters the carved chambers at certain times of day, the alignment of shadows across ancient reliefs, the silence that settles between the stones. These are experiences that invite observation rather than conclusion. So what remains here? A naturally formed structure later shaped by human hands, certainly. A medieval religious site, clearly. But layered onto that is a longer, less defined history. one that may be lost to time or perhaps never fully written in the first place. Standing among these stone pillars, one question persists without resolution. How many stories does the rock still hold that we have not yet learned to read? From the quiet stone spires of northern Europe, the story does not end. It shifts, as if the search for meaning moves across continents rather than time. If the Externsteine speak in vertical silence carved into sandstone, then far to the east, another site speaks in a different language entirely, one of earth, ash, and carefully arranged daily life preserved beneath layers of soil. In the Wei River Valley near present-day Xi'an, China, the Banpo site lies partially reconstructed today, but still anchored in the remains of a Neolithic settlement that dates back roughly to 4,500 to 3,750 BC. It is not a towering monument or a singular structure that demands attention. Instead, it is something more intimate, and perhaps more revealing. A village, a footprint of human life preserved in circular pits, communal spaces, and fragments of pottery that once carried water, grain, and fire. The landscape here is gentle, shaped by rolling loess hills that erode easily under wind and rain. It is precisely this soil, soft, fine, and easily carved, that allowed Banpo to be preserved in the first place. Over thousands of years, structures were buried, sealed, and forgotten, only to be rediscovered in the 1950s during construction work. What emerged was not a single mystery, but an entire way of life frozen in place. Archaeologists uncovered semi-subterranean dwellings, round and rectangular homes dug partially into the ground, likely roofed with wooden frames and thatch. At the center of the site stood a communal area, suggesting shared activity rather than isolated living. Nearby, pottery kilns reveal a developed understanding of high-temperature firing techniques. The ceramics themselves, often decorated with geometric patterns and stylized fish motifs, suggest a symbolic language that was not purely functional. And yet, what draws sustained attention is not just what was found, but how coherently it all fits together. Banpo does not appear as a tentative or experimental settlement. It feels organized, intentional, almost established in its systems. Storage pits are carefully spaced. Living quarters follow recognizable patterns. Waste disposal areas are separated from habitation zones in a way that implies awareness of hygiene and planning far beyond simple survival. How did such coordination emerge so early in human history? Conventional archaeology explains it as part of the broader Yangshao culture, a Neolithic society that gradually developed agriculture, pottery, and settled village life along river systems. Millet farming is well documented here, along with domesticated animals such as pigs and dogs. Over generations, knowledge accumulated, and social structures formed naturally around shared survival. But even within this framework, Banpo raises quiet questions. The consistency of its layout suggests shared understanding across generations, an inherited blueprint of living. Was this purely practical evolution, or was there something more structured guiding the design of early settlements like this? The absence of written language leaves that question suspended in silence. Among the most intriguing discoveries are the burial practices. Separate cemeteries were found outside the main living areas, with children often buried in urns beneath house floors. Adults, meanwhile, were placed in designated burial grounds, sometimes accompanied by pottery or tools. The distinctions hint at a complex belief system, one in which life, death, and space were carefully separated, yet still connected within the rhythm of the village. Some researchers interpret these practices as evidence of ancestor veneration, a tradition that would later become deeply embedded in Chinese cultural history. Others note that the patterns at Banpo feel unusually formalized for such an early period, as if ritual behavior was already well developed rather than in its infancy. The pottery itself adds another layer of quiet mystery. Certain designs appear repeatedly, fish, nets, and abstract patterns that may or may not represent natural or symbolic concepts. Were these purely decorative, or did they encode meaning lost to time? Without written records, interpretation remains open, and every theory rests on fragile ground. In more speculative circles, Banpo has occasionally been linked to broader questions about the rapid emergence of organized Neolithic cultures across different parts of the world. Why do similarly structured villages appear in distant regions within overlapping timeframes? Is this simply parallel development driven by agriculture, or does it reflect deeper patterns in how human societies naturally organize themselves when conditions stabilize? Mainstream archaeology leans firmly toward independent development shaped by environment and necessity, yet the uniformity of certain early settlement patterns continues to invite curiosity. Not as evidence of connection, but as a reminder that human behavior, even in isolation, often converges toward similar solutions. Walking through the reconstructed remains of Banpo today, one sees low outlines marking ancient homes, storage pits reduced to shallow impressions, and pottery shards preserved behind glass. The site is quiet, but not empty. It suggests movement that once filled these spaces, hands shaping clay, fires burning in communal kilns, voices coordinating daily survival along riverbanks that still flow nearby. And yet, despite decades of study, Banpo does not fully resolve into certainty. It offers clarity of structure, but ambiguity of meaning. It shows how people lived, but not entirely why they lived in exactly this way, with such early sophistication in organization and symbolism. So the question remains, not as a demand for answers, but as an invitation to pause. How much of early human life do we truly understand, and how much still lies beneath the soil, waiting quietly for its story to be retold? From the quiet remains of Neolithic villages along ancient river valleys, the journey continues across continents and into dramatically different terrain, where earth gives way to stone, and human settlement seems to merge directly with the contours of the mountains themselves. In the Andes of Peru, high above the Sacred Valley, another archaeological landscape emerges from mist and elevation: Pisac. Set along a ridge that overlooks sweeping mountain slopes and the winding Urubamba River far below, the Pisac Archaeological Site is not a single structure, but a vast complex of terraces, ceremonial centers, residential areas, and defensive walls. It stretches across the mountainside like an extension of the land itself, following contours so precisely that it is sometimes difficult to distinguish where natural geology ends and human engineering begins. At first glance, the terraces dominate the view, long geometric steps carved into steep slopes. They descend in ordered layers, stabilizing the mountain while also transforming it into arable land. These terraces are a hallmark of Andean engineering, attributed largely to the Inca civilization, who mastered agriculture at extreme altitudes. Soil was transported, carefully layered and maintained to create microclimates capable of supporting crops such as maize and potatoes in conditions that would otherwise seem inhospitable. Yet Pisac is more than agricultural ingenuity. Higher up the ridge lie residential and ceremonial sectors, built from precisely cut stone fitted without mortar. Walls curve and align with a sophistication that reflects not only structural knowledge, but an aesthetic sensitivity to the landscape. Doorways and windows are shaped to frame distant peaks, as if the mountains themselves were part of the architecture. Among the most striking features are the funerary towers, known as chulpas, perched along cliffs and remote ledges. These structures were used for burial practices in pre-Columbian Andean cultures, including groups that preceded or were absorbed into Inca rule. Their placement, often in difficult-to-access locations, raises quiet questions. Why place the dead in such exposed yet unreachable positions? Was it protection, reverence, or something more symbolic in the relationship between elevation and the afterlife? Mainstream archaeology explains Pisac as part of the broader Inca expansion during the 15th century AD, particularly under rulers who sought to integrate earlier settlements into a vast imperial network. The site likely served multiple functions: agricultural production, military oversight, religious ceremony, and control of movement through the Sacred Valley. Its position made it strategically valuable, overseeing routes that connected highland and jungle regions. And yet, even within this structured interpretation, Pisac carries a sense of layered time. Some sections of the masonry differ in style and precision, suggesting phases of construction that may not all belong to a single cultural moment. This has led researchers to consider whether earlier foundations existed before Inca adaptation, structures that were expanded, repurposed, or absorbed into imperial design. What then did the landscape look like before the Inca shaped it into terraces and temples? Archaeological evidence points to earlier Andean cultures, such as the Quilchi, who occupied parts of the region before Inca dominance. But the transitions between these periods remain partially obscured, as later construction often built directly over earlier remains, blending histories into a single visible layer. Some observers have noted the remarkable alignment of certain structures with astronomical events. At specific times of year, light and shadow interact with stone walls in ways that suggest intentional orientation toward solstices and celestial cycles. The Inca worldview placed strong emphasis on astronomical observation, linking the movement of the sun, moon, and stars to agricultural and ceremonial calendars. But at Pisac, the precision of some alignments continues to invite questions about how such knowledge was developed and transmitted across generations. Beyond official interpretations, more speculative perspectives occasionally emerge. Some propose that sites like Pisac were not merely settlements or ceremonial centers, but part of a broader sacred geography, where mountains, rivers, and constructed spaces formed an interconnected system of meaning. In this view, the terraces are not just agricultural tools, but symbolic steps connecting different layers of existence: earth, sky, and something in between. Others point to the sheer scale and coordination required to construct such a site at high altitude. Without modern machinery, entire mountainsides were reshaped using stone tools, human labor, and carefully organized communal effort. How were thousands of workers coordinated across difficult terrain and thin air? Conventional history attributes this to the administrative strength of the Inca state, which mobilized labor through systems of obligation and reciprocity. Still, the physical reality of the achievement can feel difficult to fully grasp, even when explained. Walking through Pisac today, one encounters silence broken only by wind moving through stone corridors. The terraces descend in endless repetition, and from certain vantage points, the valley opens like a vast green basin far below. It is easy to imagine movement here: processions along ridge paths, agricultural cycles unfolding across seasons, rituals conducted in spaces aligned with sky and mountain. And yet, much remains uncertain. The site is understood in outline, but not entirely in depth. Which structures belonged to daily life and which were reserved for ceremony? How much of the original design reflects Inca innovation, and how much reflects older traditions absorbed into their expanding world? Perhaps the most enduring question is not about construction alone, but intention. What did these carefully shaped terraces, aligned stones, and elevated burial places mean to those who built them? Were they purely functional solutions to life in a demanding environment, or did they represent a worldview in which landscape itself was alive with purpose? Even now, standing among the ruins of Pisac, the mountains do not feel like a backdrop. They feel present, watching, surrounding, holding memory in stone and shadow. And the question remains, quietly suspended in the high Andean air: how much of this landscape have we truly understood, and how much still waits beneath time and silence, just beyond recognition? From the high terraces of the Andes, where stone cities cling to mountainsides as if shaped by the land itself, the journey shifts once more, this time across oceans and into colder, more volatile waters. The setting changes, but the sense of isolation remains. In the Atlantic Ocean, off the western coast of Ireland, a remote island rises abruptly from the sea. Skellig Michael. Jagged and steep, Skellig Michael is a rock of dark slate and weather-worn stone, its cliffs plunging directly into the Atlantic below. Waves crash endlessly against its base, and seabirds circle its peaks in constant motion, as if the island itself is alive with wind and wings. From a distance, it appears almost uninhabitable, a place defined more by exposure than shelter, more by endurance than comfort. Yet high on its slopes, carved into terraces that defy the steepness of the rock, lies an ancient monastic settlement. Stone beehive huts, known as clochons, are arranged in careful clusters along narrow paths and stairways. These structures, built without mortar, are shaped like inverted domes, designed to withstand relentless wind and rain. They appear simple, but their construction reveals deep understanding of balance, pressure, and survival in extreme conditions. Historical records place the monastic settlement of Skellig Michael somewhere between the 6th and 12th centuries A.D., though the earliest origins remain uncertain. Irish Christian monks are believed to have established the site during a period when remote locations were sought as places of spiritual isolation. Removed from mainland society, these monks lived lives of extreme austerity, devoted to prayer, manuscript preservation, and contemplation. Access to the island itself is difficult even today. Steep stone steps rise from the landing point, cut directly into the rock face. There are no railings, no natural shelter, only a narrow ascent that winds upward toward the monastery. At the top, the settlement is arranged across terraces that seem impossibly small for sustained habitation. Storage areas, oratories, sleeping quarters, and small gardens were all carved into the limited space available. And yet, despite its harshness, the site was inhabited for centuries. How did such a remote and exposed location sustain human life for so long? Conventional explanations point to strong religious motivation. Early Christian monasticism often embraced isolation as a path toward spiritual clarity, and Skellig Michael represents one of its most extreme expressions. The monks here were not merely retreating from society, they were reshaping their relationship with the physical world itself. Archaeological evidence suggests a carefully organized community. Rainwater was collected in stone channels. Small gardens were cultivated in sheltered pockets of soil. Fish and seabirds likely formed part of the diet, supplemented by what could be grown in such limited conditions. Every aspect of life appears to have been adapted to survival on the edge of the Atlantic. But even within this practical understanding, Skellig Michael carries an unusual sense of timelessness. The stone huts, with their perfectly corbelled roofs, feel both primitive and precise. Their geometry is consistent, almost mathematical, yet their arrangement follows the irregular contours of the rock. It is as if the builders were responding not only to necessity, but to something inherent in the landscape itself. Some scholars have noted that the island's isolation may have predated Christianity. While no definitive evidence confirms earlier settlement, the possibility remains open. Could Skellig Michael have held significance before the arrival of monastic life? Its position, far from the mainland, yet prominently visible on clear days, invites speculation about whether it may have been known, visited, or regarded in earlier traditions. In broader Celtic cosmology, natural sites such as islands, mountains, and wells often held spiritual meaning long before formal religious structures were built. These landscapes were not separate from belief. They were part of it. In this context, Skellig Michael may have been perceived not just as a remote island, but as a threshold between worlds, land and sea, known and unknown, human and elemental. The monks who later inhabited the island may have understood this symbolism in their own way. Christianity in early medieval Ireland often absorbed and reinterpreted earlier cultural frameworks rather than replacing them entirely. Thus, the decision to build a monastery here may have carried layers of meaning beyond simple isolation. Was Skellig Michael chosen solely for its remoteness, or because it already held a sense of sacred separation? The physical effort required to construct the site adds another dimension to its story. Every stone had to be carried or shaped on steep, unstable terrain. The stairways alone represent a monumental labor investment, carved directly into vertical rock faces exposed to Atlantic storms. Why commit such effort to a place so difficult to inhabit? The answer may lie in devotion, but the scale of the undertaking still invites reflection. Over time, the monastery was eventually abandoned, likely due to changing climate conditions, shifting religious practices, and increasing connection with the mainland. By the late medieval period, Skellig Michael was no longer permanently inhabited. Yet its structures remained, enduring centuries of wind, salt, and erosion with remarkable resilience. Today, the island is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its ruins are carefully preserved. Visitors who make the difficult journey still encounter the same stark silence that once shaped monastic life. The Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, and the wind moves through stone corridors as it always has. Standing among the beehive huts, one question quietly emerges. Was Skellig Michael simply a place of refuge and devotion, chosen for its isolation and shaped by necessity? Or did its builders perceive something deeper in this remote rock rising from the sea, something that made it not just a location, but a destination already marked by meaning long before it was inhabited? The island offers no answer, only wind, stone, and the enduring sense that some places are never fully explained, only experienced, and then left to the silence that follows. From the wind-lashed isolation of Skellig Michael, where stone beehive huts cling to Atlantic rock like memories carved into survival itself, the journey returns to land, but not to softness. Instead, it moves to a landscape that feels equally shaped by time and restraint, though in a very different way. In the limestone plateau of County Clare, Ireland, where the Burren stretches in fractured gray expanses, another ancient site rests quietly within the open land: Caherconnell Stone Fort. At first approach, Caherconnell does not rise dramatically from its surroundings. There are no towering cliffs or ocean storms here. Instead, it appears as a circular enclosure of dry stone walls, carefully arranged from limestone slabs stacked without mortar. The fort blends into the pale rock of the Burren itself, so seamlessly that it almost seems to emerge from the ground rather than being built upon it. Sheep often graze nearby, moving across a landscape that feels both pastoral and ancient, as if time itself has softened its edges rather than erased them. Archaeologically, Caherconnell is understood as a ring fort, likely constructed and used between roughly the early medieval period, around 600 AD onward, and later centuries. These stone forts are common across Ireland, numbering in the tens of thousands in various forms. They are generally interpreted as enclosed farmsteads, places where extended families lived, worked, and protected their livestock. Caherconnell, in particular, has been partially excavated, revealing evidence of domestic activity, including cooking areas, tools, and animal remains. And yet, even with this functional explanation, the structure carries a sense of deliberate precision that invites closer attention. The walls are thick and carefully constructed, forming a near-perfect circle. This geometry is not unusual for ring forts, but at Caherconnell, the preservation allows one to see the intention behind the form with unusual clarity. Why circles? Why this repeated pattern across the Irish landscape for centuries? Mainstream archaeology suggests practicality. Circular enclosures distribute structural stress evenly, resist collapse, and provide efficient use of enclosed space. They also offer defensive advantages, limiting weak points in the perimeter. In a time when livestock represented wealth and survival, enclosing animals within protective walls would have been essential. Caherconnell fits comfortably within this model of early medieval rural life. But as excavation deepens understanding, it also reveals complexity. Within the fort, archaeologists have uncovered evidence not only of habitation, but of specialized activity. Metalworking debris, animal processing areas, and carefully arranged hearths suggest that this was not a simple, static homestead. It may have functioned as a place of production, trade, and seasonal gathering, integrated into a wider network of similar settlements across the region. How connected were these communities? The Burren today appears quiet and sparsely populated, but in early medieval Ireland, it was part of a much more densely occupied cultural landscape. Ring forts like Caherconnell may have formed nodes in a broader social system, each enclosure a point in a living map of kinship, obligation, and exchange. And yet, the silence of the site today makes it difficult to fully reconstruct that world. Standing inside the stone ring, one is surrounded not by noise or movement, but by stillness and open sky. The walls, though low, create a subtle boundary between inside and outside, past and present. It is easy to imagine life here, but harder to define its emotional texture. Was it secure, confined, communal, or something else entirely? Some researchers have suggested that ring forts like Caherconnell may have held symbolic significance beyond their practical use. The circular form, in many ancient cultures, is associated with cycles, life, seasons, continuity. In the Irish landscape, where myth and geography often intertwine, it is tempting, though not definitive, to consider whether these enclosures carried meaning beyond function. Were they simply defensive homesteads, or did their shape reflect a worldview in which boundaries between domestic life and natural order were carefully negotiated? Local tradition and folklore often preserve echoes of older interpretations. In Irish storytelling, ring forts are sometimes associated with the sea, or fairy folk, beings said to inhabit ancient earthworks and mounds. While modern archaeology does not support supernatural explanations, these traditions reflect how later generations perceived these structures, not just as ruins of past human life, but as places that resisted full explanation, even in memory. Caherconnell itself has yielded evidence of long-term use and adaptation. Excavations have revealed that the site was not a single-phase construction, but one that evolved over time. Modifications to entrances, rebuilding of walls, and changes in internal layout suggest continued occupation and adjustment to shifting needs. This raises a quiet question. How did the meaning of this space change for those who lived within it across generations? The fort also sits within a broader landscape of archaeological significance. The Burren contains numerous ring forts, tombs, and ancient field systems, all embedded in a terrain shaped by both human and geological processes. Limestone pavements stretch across the region, forming natural patterns that mirror, in strange ways, the circular and enclosed structures built by people. Was this visual harmony coincidental, or did early builders respond intuitively to the forms already present in the land? There is no need to assume intention beyond what evidence supports, yet the relationship between structure and environment here feels unusually balanced. Caherconnell does not dominate its surroundings. It belongs to them. The stones are the same stone beneath the soil. The fort is not imposed upon the landscape. It is gathered from it. Today, archaeological work continues at the site, including experimental archaeology and educational reconstructions that attempt to recreate aspects of early medieval life. These efforts bring fragments of the past into clearer focus, but they also highlight how much remains uncertain. Daily routines can be inferred, but not fully known. Social dynamics can be modeled, but not experienced. So what remains at Caherconnell Stone Fort? A structure of stone, certainly. A record of habitation, trade, and rural life in early medieval Ireland, without question. But also something quieter, an arrangement of space that still invites interpretation, even after centuries of study. And standing within its circular walls, under the open sky of the Burren, one question lingers without resolution. Was this fort simply a practical enclosure for survival, or does its enduring form hint at something deeper in how ancient communities understood boundaries, belonging, and the spaces they chose to define as their world? From the quiet stone enclosure of Caherconnell in the Irish limestone landscape, where circular walls echo early medieval life in its most intimate form, the journey moves once again, north and east, across sea and land, into a terrain where ancient earthworks take on a far more militarized character. The landscape changes first. Rolling green hills give way to the rugged frontier of northern Britain, where wind moves across open moorland with a constant, unsettled presence. Here, along the line of what was once the edge of a vast empire, lies Vindolanda Fort. Nestled just south of what would later become Hadrian's Wall, Vindolanda is not immediately visible in its entirety. The site is layered, almost stratified by time itself. Earthworks rise gently from the ground, outlining rectangular enclosures that once held barracks, granaries, workshops, and administrative buildings. Unlike stone monuments that announce themselves with permanence, Vindolanda feels partially absorbed into the soil, its history not fully exposed but continuously uncovered. Historically, Vindolanda was a Roman auxiliary fort established around the late 1st century AD during the Roman expansion into Britannia. It served as part of a network of military installations designed to control movement, monitor local populations, and secure the northern frontier of the empire. Over time, the fort was rebuilt multiple times, each phase slightly shifting its position and structure. Timber was replaced with stone, layouts were adjusted, and entire sections were reconfigured as military needs changed. What makes Vindolanda particularly remarkable is not only its strategic role, but the extraordinary preservation of everyday life within it. Due to unique soil conditions, low oxygen, high moisture, and consistent burial layers, organic materials that would normally decay have survived in astonishing detail. Wooden tablets, leather shoes, textiles, and even fragments of written correspondence have been recovered from the site. Among the most famous finds are the Vindolanda tablets, thin wooden sheets inscribed with ink, revealing personal letters, military reports, and administrative notes. They provide an unusually intimate glimpse into life on the edge of empire. One can read requests for supplies, complaints about conditions, and arrangements for social gatherings. The voices behind them feel immediate, as if time has collapsed into something briefly legible. And yet, even with this remarkable clarity, Vindolanda still raises deeper questions. The fort was repeatedly rebuilt, sometimes directly over earlier structures, sometimes slightly offset, as if the ground itself was being reinterpreted rather than simply reused. Why was there such persistence in maintaining this exact location? What made this particular stretch of land so essential to Roman presence in northern Britain? Mainstream archaeology explains this through geography and strategy. Vindolanda sits near key routes through the Pennines, controlling access between lowland and highland regions. It also functioned as a logistical hub, supporting larger defensive systems including Hadrian's Wall, constructed in the early 2nd century AD under Emperor Hadrian. In this view, Vindolanda was not mysterious, but methodical, a piece in a carefully engineered imperial system. Yet the lived reality preserved in its remains adds layers that feel more complex than pure military logic. The tablets reveal families living within or near the fort, including women and children. There are references to social visits, clothing, and personal concerns that extend beyond the strict boundaries of military discipline. This suggests that Vindolanda was not only a garrison, but a community, one that existed in a constant state of negotiation between duty and daily life. What does it mean for a military installation to become a home, even temporarily? And how did individuals experience this edge of empire existence, where political boundaries were enforced not only through walls and weapons, but through routine and endurance? Some scholars have noted the almost uncanny level of detail preserved at Vindolanda compared to other Roman military sites. The survival of ink-written documents, in particular, feels almost accidental, dependent on very specific environmental conditions that rarely align. This has led to reflections on how fragile our understanding of history truly is. Entire administrative systems, personal relationships, and moments of decision-making are preserved here only because soil chemistry happened to favor preservation. In more speculative interpretations, Vindolanda is sometimes discussed not as an anomaly in itself, but as part of a broader pattern, the tendency of frontier zones to generate hybrid cultures. Roman military structure interacted with local Brittonic populations, producing a layered society that was neither fully Roman nor entirely indigenous. Material culture reflects this blending, objects that follow Roman styles alongside local adaptations, architectural forms that shift between imported and regional traditions. Was Vindolanda simply an outpost of empire, or was it something more fluid, a space where identities overlapped and shifted over time? The archaeological record suggests coexistence, but the lived experience behind that coexistence remains largely inaccessible. Even the fort's repeated destruction and rebuilding adds a quiet tension to its story. Fires, abandonment phases, and reconstruction cycles suggest instability beneath the surface of imperial order. Each rebuilding effort raises the question: was Vindolanda being restored to preserve continuity or reassert control over a place that continually resisted permanence? Walking through the site today, one sees low stone outlines marking former buildings, reconstructed sections indicating barracks and gates, and open fields that once held structured activity. The wind moves across the site without obstruction, and it is difficult to imagine the density of life that once filled these spaces. Yet, beneath the visible ruins, the ground still holds layers that have not been fully excavated, each one representing another chapter not yet fully read. And perhaps that is what defines Vindolanda most clearly, not just what has been uncovered, but what remains buried. The fort is both a source of extraordinary clarity and an invitation to uncertainty. It shows us names, objects, and structures, but not the full weight of experience behind them. So the question lingers, as it does across so many ancient sites. How much of Vindolanda's story is known through evidence, and how much still rests beneath the soil, waiting for conditions and time to reveal what has never yet been seen? From the misty frontier of Roman Britain at Vindolanda, where ink-written words survived beneath soil like fragments of a living memory, the journey moves once more, far beyond the edges of Europe, across deserts, river plains, and time itself. The landscape shifts into something broader, warmer, and older in its silence. In the northwestern plains of the Indian subcontinent, where the Ghaggar-Hakra river system once sustained vast settlements, lies one of the most significant yet still partially unfolding archaeological sites in South Asia, Rakhigarhi. At first approach, Rakhigarhi does not resemble a city in the way modern imagination might expect. There are no standing monuments, no towering structures rising above the horizon. Instead, it is a spread of mounds, large, uneven elevations of earth and debris that stretch across the landscape like sleeping hills. Beneath them lies one of the largest known urban centers of the ancient Indus Valley civilization, dating back to roughly 2600 to 1900 BC. The scale alone is striking. Excavations suggest that Rakhigarhi was not a small settlement, but a major urban hub, covering hundreds of hectares at its peak. Streets, drainage systems, residential blocks, and craft areas have been identified beneath the soil. The layout reflects a high degree of planning. Straight roads intersect at measured angles, houses are arranged in structured grids, and water management systems indicate careful engineering in a riverine environment that was both fertile and unpredictable. Yet even with this clarity of urban design, Rakhigarhi retains a sense of distance. Much of it remains unexcavated. Only portions have been systematically explored, leaving vast areas still buried beneath layers of time. What remains hidden beneath these mounds? Entire neighborhoods? Administrative centers? Ritual spaces that have yet to be fully understood? Mainstream archaeology places Rakhigarhi firmly within the broader Indus Valley civilization, a network of interconnected cities including Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Dholavira. This civilization is known for its remarkable uniformity in urban planning, standardized weights and measures, and advanced sanitation systems. Unlike many ancient cultures, however, it has left behind no clearly deciphered written language. Thousands of seals and inscriptions have been discovered, yet their meaning remains unconfirmed. This absence of readable text creates a profound gap in understanding. We can see the structure of life, but not hear its voice directly. What were these people called themselves? How did they describe their cities, their rivers, their beliefs? Rakhigarhi holds physical answers, but not linguistic ones. Among the most intriguing discoveries at the site are burial remains that suggest complex funerary practices. Excavations have revealed skeletons laid with care, sometimes accompanied by pottery and personal items. Some burials appear to follow consistent orientation patterns, hinting at shared ritual understanding. Genetic studies conducted on remains from the region have also contributed to ongoing discussions about population continuity and migration patterns in South Asia, though interpretations remain carefully debated within academic circles. And yet, even with scientific analysis, Rakhigarhi raises questions that extend beyond data. Why did such a large and sophisticated urban center eventually decline? The Indus Valley civilization as a whole appears to have gradually transformed or dispersed rather than collapsing in a single catastrophic event. Climate change, river shifts, and evolving trade networks are often cited as contributing factors. The drying of river systems may have slowly altered the viability of large urban settlements, leading populations to migrate and reorganize. But the transition is not fully visible in the archaeological record. There is no single moment that marks disappearance, only gradual silence. Cities like Rakhigarhi were not destroyed in a dramatic sense. They were slowly emptied, absorbed into changing landscapes and shifting human patterns. Some researchers have explored the possibility that Rakhigarhi, like other Indus cities, may have been part of a far more interconnected cultural system than previously understood. The uniformity in weights, seals, and urban planning across vast distances suggests coordination or shared cultural principles that remain difficult to fully reconstruct. Was this the result of centralized governance, or a deeply embedded cultural coherence that did not require political centralization as understood in later empires? There are also interpretive questions surrounding symbolism. The seals found across Indus sites often depict animals, geometric forms, and abstract signs. Some propose they may represent administrative records, while others suggest religious or cosmological meaning. Without a deciphered script, each interpretation remains open, suspended between evidence and uncertainty. Rakhigarhi itself has yielded artifacts that hint at daily life: pottery fragments, beads made from semi-precious stones, tools shaped from bone and metal. These objects suggest skilled craftsmanship and trade networks that extended across regions. Materials found here connect to distant geological sources, implying movement of goods across significant distances. But the exact structure of these networks, how they functioned, who organized them, remains unclear. Walking through the site today, one sees excavated trenches cutting through ancient mounds, revealing layers of habitation stacked over centuries. Each layer represents a phase of life, yet only fragments are visible at any given time. The rest remains embedded, waiting for future excavation or perhaps never to be fully uncovered. There is a quiet tension in this partial visibility. Unlike monumental sites where stone structures remain above ground, Rakhigarhi exists mostly beneath perception. It is a city that must be imagined through excavation reports, soil layers, and scattered artifacts. And in that sense, it feels less like a finished discovery and more like an ongoing conversation with time. What kind of society built such an extensive urban network without leaving behind readable historical narratives? Was their understanding of record-keeping fundamentally different from later civilizations, or has the key to their communication simply not yet been found? Even now, new excavations continue to refine understanding, but they also expand the sense of what is still unknown. Each uncovered wall or artifact adds detail, yet also expands the boundaries of mystery. The more that is revealed, the more complex the picture becomes. And so Rakhigarhi remains suspended between clarity and silence, a vast, ancient city partially seen, partially hidden, and not yet fully understood. As the exploration moves forward through time and across continents, one question persists quietly beneath every discovery. How many entire civilizations still lie beneath the surface of what we think we already know, waiting for the earth to speak again? From the buried expanse of Rakhigarhi, where an entire urban world lies folded beneath the plains of the Indus Valley, the journey shifts once more, crossing continents and descending toward another kind of silence. This silence is not born from river systems or fertile soil, but from desert wind and sand that never stops moving. In the arid reaches of southern Peru, near the Nazca region, a vast ceremonial landscape emerges from the dunes, Cahuachi. At first sight, Cahuachi does not resemble a city in the conventional sense. There are no towering stone structures, no dense urban grid preserved in stone. Instead, it is a sprawling complex of adobe mounds, plazas, and low pyramidal platforms spread across the desert floor. From above, it appears almost subdued, as if the land itself is only gently disturbed rather than dramatically shaped. Yet beneath this quiet surface lies one of the most important ceremonial centers of the ancient Nazca culture, active roughly between 1 AD and 500 AD. The desert here is unforgiving. It preserves by dry erosion rather than sheltering. Wind sculpts the surface, while sand both reveals and conceals. Within this environment, Cahuachi rises in fragmented forms, mud brick structures eroded by time, their edges softened, their outlines incomplete. And yet, despite this fragility, the scale of the site is immense. Archaeologists have identified dozens of mound structures, ceremonial plazas, and enclosed spaces that suggest large gatherings rather than permanent habitation. Mainstream archaeology interprets Cahuachi not as a city of daily life, but as a pilgrimage and ritual center. The Nazca culture, known widely for the vast geoglyphs etched into the surrounding desert, lines, geometric shapes, and enormous figures visible only from elevated perspectives, appears to have used Cahuachi as a focal point for ceremonial activity. People likely traveled from surrounding valleys to participate in rituals, seasonal gatherings, and religious observances. Excavations have revealed offerings buried within the site, textiles, pottery, and carefully arranged objects placed in intentional contexts. Some mounds contain evidence of ceremonial burials, suggesting that the site held spiritual significance tied to ancestors or deities. The absence of dense domestic housing reinforces the idea that Cahuachi was not a permanent urban settlement, but a place of periodic convergence. Yet even within this framework, questions remain open. Why did such a large ceremonial center develop in a region so dependent on seasonal water sources and fragile ecological balance? The Nazca people engineered extensive underground aqueduct systems, known as pukuyos, to access groundwater. This suggests a sophisticated understanding of hydrology and environmental adaptation. But how these engineering systems were coordinated with ceremonial life remains partially unclear. Cahuachi appears to have functioned at the intersection of environment and belief. The surrounding Nazca lines, etched into the desert plateau, include vast geometric patterns and animal figures spanning hundreds of meters. Their purpose is still debated. Some researchers suggest astronomical alignments. Others propose ritual pathways or symbolic representations tied to water and fertility. From Cahuachi, these lines stretch outward into the desert like messages written on a landscape rather than on paper. What relationship did the people of Cahuachi have with these geoglyphs? Were they created as part of ceremonial processions linked to the site itself? Or did they serve a broader regional system of meaning that connected scattered communities across the desert? In more speculative interpretations, Cahuachi has been viewed not just as a ceremonial center, but as a kind of symbolic map of belief, where architecture, landscape, and geoglyphs formed a unified ritual environment. In this perspective, the site is not isolated, but integrated into a wider sacred geography in which movement across space held spiritual significance. Processions may have linked mounds, plazas, and desert lines in patterns that are no longer fully recoverable. Some researchers have also noted the unusual preservation of the site despite its fragile construction material. Adobe, made from earth and water, typically erodes quickly in exposed conditions. Yet Cahuachi has endured for nearly 2 millennia, albeit in heavily degraded form. This raises a quiet question. Was its placement in the desert a deliberate choice not only for visibility or accessibility, but for permanence through abandonment, allowing ritual spaces to return slowly to the earth after use? The ceremonial nature of the site also invites reflection on social organization. Building such a large complex of non-residential structures requires coordination, labor, and shared purpose. Without a centralized urban population living permanently on site, what sustained this level of construction? Was authority concentrated in religious leadership, seasonal gatherings, or distributed across regional communities who shared ritual responsibilities? Archaeological evidence suggests that Cahuachi may have been constructed and modified over several phases, with structures added, expanded, and abandoned over time. This layered development creates a sense of temporal depth, where the site is not a single moment in history, but a sequence of overlapping ceremonial expressions. Walking among the low adobe mounds today, it is difficult to reconstruct the intensity of activity that once filled this space. The desert is quiet now, broken only by wind and distant movement of sand. Yet beneath the surface, excavation reveals traces of painted walls, ritual offerings, and carefully constructed spaces designed for gathering and ceremony. There is also an emotional dimension to Cahuachi that resists easy categorization. Unlike fortified cities or domestic settlements, it does not project permanence in the same way. It feels transient, even in its construction, a place meant to be visited, activated, and perhaps left to silence again. This cyclical presence and absence gives it a character that is both architectural and ephemeral. And so the question persists, suspended in the desert air. What kind of society builds a vast ceremonial center, not to dominate the landscape, but to temporarily inhabit it, leaving behind only traces of gatherings, rituals, and meaning that must now be pieced together from fragments buried in sand? From the silent adobe mounds of Cahuachi, where desert winds preserve fragments of ritual gatherings long dissolved into sand, the journey turns northward once more, away from the arid coasts of Peru, across continents and millennia, into a landscape shaped by rivers, clay, and early human settlement at the edges of Mesopotamian history. In southeastern Turkey, near the modern town of Nusaybin and close to the Syrian border, rises an ancient mound that holds within it one of the earliest chapters of complex human expression, Tel Halaf. At first glance, Tel Halaf appears unremarkable to the untrained eye, a large earthen mound, or tell, formed by centuries of layered human occupation. These mounds are common across the ancient Near East, built not intentionally, but gradually, as generations constructed homes, rebuilt structures, and lived atop the remains of those who came before. Over time, the accumulation of debris, architecture, and daily life creates an artificial hill, quietly preserving entire civilizations beneath its surface. Yet, Tel Halaf is not an ordinary mound. It was here, in the early 20th century, that extraordinary archaeological discoveries revealed traces of a forgotten culture dating back to approximately 6,000 to 5,000 BC. This was the Halaf culture, one of the earliest known farming communities in northern Mesopotamia, predating many of the better-known civilizations that would later define the region. The most striking finds from Tel Halaf were not monumental stone cities or grand architectural remains, but finely crafted pottery. These ceramics, often painted with intricate geometric patterns, spirals, and stylized animal forms, display a level of artistic sophistication that feels unexpectedly refined for such an early period. The designs are precise, balanced, and repeated across vessels with a consistency that suggests shared symbolic language or cultural identity. How did such artistic coherence emerge so early in human settlement history? The Halaf culture is generally understood as part of the broader Neolithic expansion, when agriculture began to take root in fertile river valleys. Communities shifted from nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyles into more permanent settlements. With stability came craft specialization, trade, and the development of shared visual traditions. Tel Halaf itself later gained further significance in archaeological history when excavations in the early 1900s uncovered large stone sculptures and architectural fragments from a much later Iron Age settlement built atop the earlier Neolithic layers. These include monumental statues of lions, bulls, and hybrid creatures, beings with human and animal characteristics that once stood at gateways and ceremonial spaces. These sculptures, associated with the Aramean city-state of Guzana around 1000 BC, represent a dramatic cultural shift layered directly above the much older Neolithic remains. The contrast is striking. Beneath, the quiet precision of early agricultural pottery. Above, powerful stone guardians carved with expressive, almost animated forms. Two vastly different worlds separated by thousands of years, yet physically connected through the same mound. And yet, even with this clear stratification, Tel Halaf raises deeper questions about cultural memory and continuity. Why was this location chosen repeatedly across such vast stretches of time? What made this mound a focal point for settlement across different civilizations? Mainstream archaeology explains this through geography. The region lies near fertile river systems and trade routes connecting Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant. Settlements naturally clustered in such areas, and tells formed wherever human habitation persisted over long periods. Tel Halaf, in this view, is not unusual. It is simply one of many layered sites built upon environmental advantage. But the richness of its material culture invites further reflection. The Halaf pottery tradition, in particular, appears suddenly in the archaeological record with remarkable sophistication. Its painted motifs are not crude or experimental, but highly developed. This raises quiet questions about the transmission of artistic knowledge in early Neolithic societies. Was this style developed gradually over generations, or did it emerge rapidly through cultural exchange across regions that are still not fully mapped? Some researchers have explored the possibility that Halaf culture was part of a wider network of early Neolithic communities that shared symbolic systems across vast distances. Similar pottery styles and settlement patterns appear across northern Mesopotamia and surrounding regions, suggesting interaction zones that are not fully understood. Was this the result of migration, trade, or shared ideological frameworks tied to early agricultural life? In more speculative interpretations, Tel Halaf has occasionally been viewed as part of a deeper cultural layering of memory, where certain locations retain significance across multiple civilizations, not purely for practical reasons, but due to inherited spatial meaning. While archaeology does not require such interpretations, the repetition of settlement at the same sites across millennia continues to invite reflection. The later Iron Age sculptures add another dimension to this sense of continuity. Their forms, guardians, mythic creatures, and symbolic figures suggest a world in which boundaries between human, animal, and divine were fluid. These were not decorative objects alone. They likely served protective or ritual functions, marking thresholds between sacred and communal spaces. Yet even these more recent artifacts remain partially enigmatic. The exact meanings of their iconography are not fully understood. Were these figures representations of local deities, ancestral protectors, or symbolic expressions of political authority? The absence of detailed written records from this specific context leaves interpretation open, anchored in comparison rather than certainty. The history of Tel Halaf itself is also marked by disruption. Many of its most important sculptures were excavated and transported to museums in the early 20th century. Some were later destroyed or damaged during periods of conflict in the region, then painstakingly reconstructed from fragments. This fractured modern history mirrors, in an unexpected way, the layered fragmentation of the site itself. Walking through reconstructed displays today, one encounters stone figures reassembled from broken pieces, standing once again in forms that approximate their original presence. Yet the gaps between fragments remain visible. They are reminders that what is seen is always partial, always reconstructed through interpretation and effort. And beneath all of this, beneath pottery, sculpture, and settlement layers, lie still deeper levels that have not been fully excavated. Each layer represents a different moment in human adaptation to land, climate, and social change. But the full sequence is still incomplete. So what remains at Tel Halaf? A Neolithic culture that speaks through pottery rather than writing. An Iron Age city that expressed itself through stone guardians. And beneath both, a mound that quietly preserves thousands of years of human presence, each layer resting upon the next without ever fully revealing the complete story. And perhaps the most enduring question is this: how many early human worlds, like the Halaf culture, still lie folded beneath such mounds, visible only in fragments, waiting for time, excavation, or chance to reveal what has never yet been fully understood? From the layered earth of Tel Halaf, where Neolithic pottery and Iron Age stone guardians coexist across millennia of accumulated human presence, the journey moves once more, this time not into deeper time beneath the ground, but outward across the vastness of the Pacific. The transition is not only geographic, but elemental. From river valleys and desert mounds, the narrative arrives at the edge of an ocean so expansive it seems to erase all sense of direction. Here, on the remote volcanic island of Rapa Nui, known to many as Easter Island, lies one of the most isolated ceremonial landscapes on Earth, Orongo. Perched along the jagged rim of the Rano Kau volcano, Orongo does not present itself as a conventional settlement. It is not a village in the ordinary sense, nor a fortified city. Instead, it is a ceremonial village built directly into the edge of a massive volcanic crater, where land drops away into cliffs that descend toward the Pacific Ocean below. Stone-built houses are arranged in low, curved forms, partially embedded into the ground, their entrances facing outward toward the sea and nearby islets rather than inward toward the island's interior. The setting alone creates an immediate sense of tension. One side opens into the vast ocean horizon, the other falls into the deep volcanic caldera filled with freshwater lake and shifting mist. It is a place where geography itself feels divided between creation and descent, stability and collapse. Orongo is most closely associated with the Tangata Manu, the Birdman cult that developed on Rapa Nui after the decline of the island's earlier Moai statue building period. This cultural shift, generally placed between the 17th and 19th centuries AD, reflects a transformation in religious and social organization. Instead of constructing massive stone figures across the island's landscape, the focus moved toward annual ritual competition centered at Orongo. Each year, representatives from different clans would gather here to participate in a dangerous contest. Competitors would descend the cliffs of Rano Kau, swim through shark-infested waters, and attempt to retrieve the first sooty tern egg from the nearby islet of Motu Nui. The first to return safely with the egg would elevate their patron chief to the status of Birdman for the year, granting political and spiritual authority. This ritual, documented through oral traditions and later ethnographic accounts, suggests a society deeply intertwined with cycles of competition, survival, and symbolic renewal. Orongo, in this interpretation, was not merely a settlement, but a ceremonial stage where leadership was temporarily redefined through physical endurance and risk. Yet even within this framework, Orongo carries an atmosphere that resists complete explanation. The placement of the village at the very edge of a collapsing volcanic crater raises quiet questions about intention and meaning. Why choose such an exposed and dangerous location for the most important annual ritual? Was the site selected purely for its proximity to the sea route of the Birdman competition, or did the dramatic geography itself hold symbolic significance? Archaeological evidence shows that the stone houses at Orongo were not intended for permanent habitation. They are small, narrow, and constructed from carefully fitted basalt slabs. Their roofs were likely covered with earth and vegetation, blending into the landscape. Inside, narrow passageways and carved rock panels display petroglyphs depicting birdmen figures, human bodies with bird heads or elongated beak-like forms, alongside representations of seabirds and ceremonial symbols. These carvings suggest a deeply symbolic visual language, one that connects human identity with avian imagery and oceanic migration patterns. The sooty tern, central to the Birdman ritual, becomes more than a bird. It becomes a marker of timing, survival, and sacred competition. But what exactly did these transformations mean in the worldview of those who carved them? Mainstream interpretations view the Birdman cult as a response to ecological and social stress. As Rapa Nui's earlier system of large-scale moai construction declined, possibly due to resource depletion, population pressure, or environmental change, society may have reorganized around more centralized and ritualized forms of authority. The Birdman competition, in this view, served as a mechanism to establish leadership in a period of limited resources and shifting social structures. But Orongo does not fully settle into this explanation. The intensity of its ritual landscape, combined with the extreme physical risk involved, suggests something more than administrative reorganization. It reflects a worldview in which authority was not inherited or permanently held, but earned repeatedly through ordeal and connection to natural cycles. Some researchers have explored the idea that Orongo represents a broader Polynesian pattern of sacred geography, where liminal spaces, cliff edges, volcanic rims, and ocean thresholds were chosen as sites of ritual significance. In such interpretations, Orongo is not simply a location, but a boundary between land and sea, life and risk, human effort and natural force. In more speculative perspectives, the Birdman imagery itself has been interpreted as symbolic of transformation or liminality, humans temporarily becoming something other than human through ritual action. While archaeology does not confirm metaphysical interpretations, the persistence of bird-human hybrid imagery across multiple carvings continues to invite reflection on how identity was understood in ritual contexts. What is clear is that Orongo functioned as a place of convergence, where physical geography, seasonal cycles, and social authority intersected in a highly structured yet deeply symbolic system. It was not a place of daily life, but of concentrated meaning, activated at specific times and then left to silence. Today, Orongo is largely uninhabited, preserved as part of Rapa Nui National Park. Visitors walking through its stone remains encounter low walls, carved petroglyphs, and sweeping views of the ocean and crater. The wind moves constantly across the ridge, and the sense of exposure remains immediate. The village feels suspended between land and sky, between history and erosion. And yet, even with archaeological and ethnographic understanding, certain questions remain unresolved. Why did such a dangerous and elaborate ritual system emerge in such an isolated environment? What deeper meaning did the Birdman transformation hold beyond political succession? And how much of Orongo's significance was tied not only to human society, but to the dramatic landscape that surrounds it? Standing at the edge of Rano Raraku, where cliffs fall away into the Pacific and wind moves without obstruction, one question lingers without answer. Was Orongo simply a ceremonial site shaped by cultural necessity, or does its placement at the very boundary of land and ocean suggest a deeper relationship between geography, ritual, and the way ancient societies understood the limits of human existence itself? From the silent volcanic slope of Rano Raraku, where unfinished stone figures remain half-emerged from the earth as if still in the act of becoming, the journey shifts once more across oceans and continents. The stillness of the Pacific gives way to a very different landscape, colder, greener, shaped by ancient winds moving across limestone plateaus and river valleys in southeastern France. Here, near modern Aix-en-Provence, lies the archaeological site known as the Oppidum d'Entremont. At first approach, there is little in the modern landscape that announces what once stood here. The hills are gentle, the vegetation Mediterranean, olive trees, scrub, and dry grasses moving under a steady breeze. Yet beneath this quiet surface lies the remains of a fortified Iron Age settlement, once belonging to the Salius, a Celtic Ligurian people who occupied this region long before Roman expansion into Gaul. The Oppidum itself, Oppidum being the Roman term for a fortified hilltop settlement, was constructed on a naturally elevated plateau. Stone walls once enclosed the site, forming defensive boundaries that defined both space and identity. Within these walls, archaeologists have uncovered traces of habitation, houses, storage areas, workshops, and communal spaces arranged in a layout that suggests both organization and adaptation to the terrain. Entremont was active primarily during the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC, a period of cultural complexity in southern Gaul. This was not a static or isolated world, but a dynamic frontier region where Celtic, Ligurian, and emerging Roman influences intersected. Trade networks connected inland communities with Mediterranean coastal cities, bringing goods, ideas, and conflict into the same spaces. Yet, what makes Entremont particularly striking is not only its settlement structure, but the extraordinary sculptures discovered within it. Among the most famous finds are stone heads and seated figures carved in a stylized manner, often referred to as warrior statues. These sculptures depict human faces with highly schematic features, large eyes, simplified mouths, and rigid expressions that seem to emphasize form over individuality. Some of these heads were discovered embedded in the fortifications themselves, reused as building material within later construction phases. Others were found scattered across the site, suggesting that they once played a more prominent role in the Oppidum's visual and cultural environment before being repurposed or displaced over time. Mainstream archaeology interprets Entremont as both a political and defensive center for the Saliés tribe. It is thought to have functioned as a regional hub where leadership, trade, and military organization were concentrated. The fortifications suggest a need for protection, likely reflecting periods of conflict with neighboring groups and, eventually, increasing pressure from expanding Roman influence in the region. By the 2nd century BC, Roman intervention in southern Gaul intensified. The eventual conquest of the area led to the decline and abandonment of many indigenous fortified settlements, including Entremont. Nearby, the Roman colony of Aquae Sextiae, modern Aix-en-Provence, would rise, reshaping the region into a Romanized landscape. Entremont, once a center of indigenous power, gradually faded from active use. But the stones remain, and with them, questions that resist simple classification. The carved heads and statues found at the site are particularly intriguing because of their uniformity and abstraction. Unlike the more naturalistic sculpture traditions that would later dominate Roman art, these figures appear deliberately stylized. Facial features are reduced to essential forms. Some interpretations suggest they may represent ancestors, elite warriors, or symbolic representations of social identity rather than individual likenesses. Why such abstraction? What purpose did these faces serve within the lived environment of Entremont? Were they meant to be seen as individuals or as archetypes, representations of roles rather than people? In mainstream interpretation, these sculptures are often linked to Celtic traditions of ancestor veneration and warrior culture. The seated figures, sometimes shown holding severed heads, are commonly associated with martial symbolism and the practice of head hunting, which is referenced in several ancient accounts of Celtic societies. Roman writers, however, often described these practices through their own cultural lens, and modern scholarship treats such accounts with caution, seeking archaeological corroboration where possible. Still, the presence of severed head imagery, whether symbolic or literal in interpretation, adds an unsettling layer to the site. It suggests a worldview in which power, identity, and memory may have been expressed through highly visual and ritualized forms. And yet, even this interpretation does not fully resolve the emotional tone of the sculptures. The faces are not overtly violent. They are still, composed, almost detached. They do not appear to react or engage. Instead, they seem to observe, fixed in a state between presence and abstraction. Could these figures have served a role beyond representation? Some researchers have proposed that they may have functioned as territorial markers, placed within the settlement to define social or political space. Others suggest they could have been part of ritual structures, possibly linked to ceremonial gatherings or commemorations of lineage and leadership. There is also the question of why so many of these sculptures were later broken, reused, or buried within walls. Was this purely practical recycling of building material during periods of reconstruction, or does it reflect a deliberate shift in cultural values, where older symbolic systems were physically dismantled and incorporated into new structures? Entremont, in this sense, becomes not just a settlement, but a layered narrative of transformation. Each phase of construction and destruction adds another layer of interpretation, but also obscures earlier meanings. The site we see today is not a single moment in time, but a compressed archive of shifting identities. Walking through the excavated remains, one encounters low stone foundations outlining former buildings, fragments of defensive walls, and carefully arranged blocks that once formed part of a complex settlement system. The landscape is open now, exposed to light and wind, but it was once enclosed, controlled, and actively inhabited. What did life feel like within those walls? Was Entremont a place of constant tension, shaped by conflict and defense, or was it also a center of community, trade, and cultural exchange? The archaeological record provides structure, but not atmosphere. It shows us how space was organized, but not how it was experienced. Even the transition from indigenous control to Roman dominance remains partially silent in the material record. Conquest is visible in broad historical outline, but the lived experience of that transformation, how people adapted, resisted, or integrated, remains fragmented. And so Entremont stands as a site of dual identity, both a fortified center of Iron Age society and a place where cultural systems visibly shifted beneath external pressure. Its sculptures, architecture, and stratigraphy all point toward a world in motion, but one whose internal meanings are still only partially understood. In the end, what remains is not a complete narrative, but a series of impressions. Stone faces staring forward without explanation, defensive walls outlining a lost settlement, and layers of occupation that hint at continuity and rupture at once. And perhaps the question that lingers most strongly here is not what Entremont was, but how many meanings were once embedded in its stones that have not survived the passage of time, and whether those meanings are truly gone or still waiting, quietly preserved beneath the soil, just beyond the limits of what archaeology can yet fully recover. Where centuries of intellectual life once unfolded across monastic courtyards and lecture halls, the journey turns once more toward the western edge of the Eurasian continent. The landscape shifts from river plains and tropical heat into a very different terrain. Dry hills, limestone ridges, and Mediterranean light filtering across the southern regions of modern France. Here, near the present-day city of Aix-en-Provence, lies one of the most important Iron Age sites of ancient Gaul, the Oppidum d'Entremont. At first approach, the Oppidum d'Entremont does not resemble the monumental cities of later civilizations. It rises modestly from the landscape, a plateau of stone and earth surrounded by gentle slopes. Yet beneath this understated profile lies a site of considerable archaeological significance, one that reveals a complex pre-Roman society deeply embedded in the cultural networks of Iron Age Europe. The Oppidum was occupied primarily between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, during a period when the Celtic-speaking peoples of southern Gaul were developing increasingly organized forms of settlement. Entremont is often associated with the Salian tribe, a confederation that controlled the region prior to Roman expansion. Its position was strategic, elevated, defensible, and overlooking routes that connected inland territories with the Mediterranean coast. From above, the settlement reveals a structured layout. Stone buildings, defensive walls, and enclosed spaces suggest a planned community rather than an organic village. The remains of fortification systems indicate an awareness of conflict and territorial control. This was not an isolated hilltop settlement, but part of a broader network of oppida, fortified centers that emerged across Iron Age Europe as focal points of political, economic, and social life. Excavations at Entremont have uncovered residential structures, storage areas, and public spaces arranged in a relatively organized manner. Stone foundations indicate rectangular buildings, while open courtyards suggest communal or administrative functions. The use of stone as a primary building material reflects both environmental adaptation and cultural expression, distinguishing these communities from earlier, less permanent settlement patterns. One of the most striking discoveries at the site is a series of carved stone sculptures and reliefs. These include depictions of human figures, some of which appear stylized and somewhat abstract by modern standards. Heads, torsos, and fragmented forms have been found embedded within architectural contexts, suggesting that sculpture played a role in the visual and symbolic environment of the settlement. Mainstream archaeology interprets Entremont as a fortified political center of the Salian elite, reflecting the increasing social stratification of Iron Age Gaul. The presence of defensive walls suggests concerns over conflict, possibly between neighboring tribes or in response to external pressures from expanding Mediterranean powers. The proximity to Greek and later Roman influence through trade routes likely contributed to both economic development and cultural exchange. Yet even within this framework, Entremont raises questions that remain only partially resolved. One of the most discussed aspects of the site is the presence of what are sometimes referred to as severed head sculptures. Stone carvings depict human heads embedded into architectural spaces, often interpreted as representations of warriors or ancestors. Some of these heads appear mounted or displayed in a manner that suggests ritual significance, possibly linked to practices of ancestor veneration, warfare symbolism, or territorial assertion. Classical sources from neighboring civilizations describe certain Celtic groups as practicing headhunting rituals, though these accounts are often filtered through external perspectives and may carry interpretive bias. Archaeological evidence from Entremont does not confirm ritual practice in a definitive sense, but the visual prominence of these sculpted heads suggests that human imagery, particularly the head, held symbolic importance within this cultural context. What remains uncertain is how these images functioned within daily life. Were they commemorative, protective, or symbolic representations of social hierarchy? Or did they serve multiple roles simultaneously within a belief system that integrated warfare, identity, and memory? The architecture of Entremont also reflects a transitional moment in Iron Age Europe. The settlement shows signs of increasing urbanization, yet it does not reach the scale or complexity of later Roman cities. It exists in a space between village and city, between tribal organization and centralized political structure. This intermediate state makes interpretation particularly challenging as it resists direct comparison with more familiar urban models. Another important feature of the site is its defensive system. The fortifications include stone walls and rampart structures that suggest coordinated construction efforts. These defenses imply not only external threats, but also the capacity for collective organization. Building such structures would have required labor coordination, resource management, and social hierarchy. Yet despite these indicators of organization, the exact nature of political authority at Entremont remains unclear. Was power concentrated in a ruling elite, or distributed among competing factions within the settlement? The archaeological record offers hints, but not definitive answers. The relationship between Entremont and the wider Mediterranean world adds another layer of complexity. Trade networks connected southern Gaul with Greek colonies along the coast, particularly in regions such as Massalia, modern Marseille. Through these networks, goods such as pottery, metalwork, and luxury items circulated, influencing local production and cultural practices. Some artifacts found at Entremont show signs of Mediterranean influence in design and technique, suggesting cultural exchange rather than isolation. Yet the settlement also maintains distinct local characteristics, indicating that external influences were adapted rather than fully adopted. This interplay between local tradition and external contact raises broader questions about cultural identity in Iron Age Gaul. How did communities like those at Entremont define themselves in relation to neighboring groups and expanding foreign powers? Was identity expressed primarily through material culture, ritual practice, or political organization? In 123 BC, the Roman Republic began its expansion into southern Gaul, leading to the eventual incorporation of the region into Roman territory. Historical accounts describe military campaigns against local tribes, including the Salians. Entremont appears to have been abandoned or destroyed around this period, though the exact sequence of events remains debated. Archaeological evidence suggests signs of conflict and disruption, but not a fully preserved narrative of collapse. As with many ancient sites, the material record shows transition, but not always causation. The final phases of occupation are marked by changes in settlement patterns and eventual relocation of populations to nearby Roman-founded cities, such as Aquae Sextiae, modern Aix-en-Provence. After abandonment, Entremont remained a visible ruin in the landscape, its stone structures gradually eroding but never entirely disappearing. Unlike sites buried from the fractured stone faces of Entremont, where Iron Age identity is preserved in stylized stone and silent expressions, the journey moves once again, this time back across the Mediterranean, toward waters that have witnessed both creation and destruction. The transition is not abrupt, but almost fluid, as if the sea itself carries memory between lands. In the southern Aegean, on the volcanic island of Santorini, lies one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the ancient world, Akrotiri Thera. At first approach, the modern landscape of Santorini appears serene. Whitewashed villages perched along cliffs, blue water stretching into the horizon, and the curved edge of the caldera forming a natural amphitheater of sea and stone. Yet beneath this tranquil surface lies a far older story, one preserved not in ruins exposed to time, but in structures sealed beneath layers of volcanic ash. Akrotiri was a thriving Bronze Age settlement of the Aegean civilization, often associated with the Minoan cultural sphere, flourishing roughly between 2000 and 1600 BC. Unlike many ancient sites that were gradually abandoned or dismantled, Akrotiri was preserved in a single catastrophic moment. A massive volcanic eruption, one of the most powerful in human history, buried the entire settlement under meters of ash and pumice. What remains today is not a ruin in the traditional sense, but a frozen city. Streets, buildings, staircases, and even multi-story structures have been uncovered in remarkable condition. The volcanic ash acted as a natural preservative, protecting organic materials, frescoes, and architectural details that would otherwise have been lost. Walking through the excavated remains of Akrotiri is like entering a paused moment in time. Walls still stand at significant heights. Doorways open into rooms that once held daily life. Storage jars remain in place. Drainage systems run beneath streets with engineered precision. There is a sense that the inhabitants did not leave gradually, but were overtaken by an event so sudden that normal rhythms of life were interrupted without warning. Yet one of the most striking aspects of Akrotiri is what is not found here. Unlike other sites destroyed by catastrophe, there is a near absence of human remains. Archaeologists have recovered no large-scale evidence of bodies within the settlement itself. This absence has led to long-standing questions. Did the population evacuate before the final eruption phase? If so, how did they know? And where did they go? Mainstream archaeological interpretation suggests that the inhabitants may have experienced precursor seismic activity, earthquakes that damaged the city and prompted evacuation prior to the final eruption. Evidence of rebuilding and repairs in some structures supports the idea of repeated seismic disturbances before the catastrophic burial event. In this view, Akrotiri was not destroyed in a single instant, but abandoned in stages as environmental warning signs accumulated. Still, the precise timeline remains difficult to reconstruct. Volcanic activity on Thera unfolded in multiple phases, and the exact sequence of evacuation, destruction, and burial is still debated. What is clear is that the eruption was immense, likely affecting climate patterns across the wider region and contributing to ash deposits found far beyond the island itself. But Akrotiri is not defined only by its destruction. It is defined equally by what it reveals about life before that moment. The frescoes of Akrotiri are among the most significant discoveries at the site. Painted on plaster walls, they depict vibrant scenes of nature, ritual, and daily activity. Dolphins swim through stylized marine environments. Ships sail across open waters. Landscapes are filled with flowers, rivers, and mountains rendered in flowing, almost rhythmic forms. Human figures appear engaged in ceremonial processions, textile work, and communal gatherings. What stands out is not only the artistry, but the sense of movement and connection. These are not static images. They feel alive with motion, suggesting a society deeply attuned to both natural environment and symbolic expression. The color palette, reds, blues, yellows, and earth tones, remains remarkably preserved due to the protective ash layers. Yet even here, interpretation is not straightforward. What exactly are these scenes depicting? Are they literal representations of daily life, or symbolic narratives tied to religious or cosmological beliefs? Some frescoes appear to blend human activity with natural environments in ways that resist simple categorization. The architecture of Akrotiri adds another layer of complexity. Multi-story buildings with carefully constructed staircases suggest advanced urban planning. Rooms were arranged with functional specialization: storage areas, living quarters, workshops, and spaces that may have served ceremonial purposes. Drainage systems indicate careful attention to sanitation and water management, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of urban infrastructure. How did such a well-organized society develop on a volcanic island shaped by instability? Was life here always lived under the awareness of geological risk, or did the population perceive the landscape as stable until the final catastrophic phase? Some researchers have suggested that the inhabitants of Akrotiri may have had cultural or ritual frameworks that incorporated volcanic activity into their worldview. The presence of symbolic imagery in frescoes has led to interpretations that natural forces, sea, sky, and possibly volcanic phenomena were integrated into their conceptual understanding of the world. However, without written records from the site itself, these interpretations remain carefully inferential. The absence of fortification walls is another notable feature. Unlike many contemporary Bronze Age settlements, Akrotiri shows no clear evidence of defensive structures. This has led to questions about its political and social environment. Was the region relatively peaceful, or were security measures expressed in ways not yet fully understood archaeologically? In broader Aegean context, Akrotiri is often linked to the Minoan civilization of Crete, though its exact political and cultural relationship remains debated. Trade connections are evident through pottery styles, materials, and artistic influence, suggesting that Akrotiri was part of a wider maritime network spanning the eastern Mediterranean. Yet, even within this network, Akrotiri feels distinct. Its preservation allows for an unusually intimate view of Aegean Bronze Age life, yet it also highlights how much remains unknown. The voices of its inhabitants are absent. Their written language, if present, has not been recovered in sufficient form to be read. What remains is architecture, art, and material culture, fragments of a society interrupted mid-continuation. Standing within the excavated city today, one moves through spaces that were once private and communal, now open to sky and silence. The contrast is striking. What was once enclosed, inhabited, and active is now exposed and still. The volcanic ash that preserved Akrotiri has also transformed it into something else, a city without present tense. And so the question persists, not as a demand for resolution, but as an invitation to reflection. How many other ancient societies were similarly preserved in moments of sudden transition, their daily lives suspended not in memory alone, but physically embedded beneath the earth? And how much of what we understand about the ancient world is shaped not by continuity, but by the rare accidents of preservation that allow us to see it at all? From the frozen silence of Akrotiri, where volcanic ash preserved an entire Bronze Age city in the moment of its disappearance, the journey shifts once again across oceans and continents. The sense of suspension remains, but the landscape changes dramatically. From the Aegean's volcanic islands, we move into the highland valleys of Central America, where mist rises through volcanic ridges and ancient cities lie buried beneath modern urban life. Here, beneath what is now Guatemala City, lies one of the most significant, yet often overlooked archaeological sites of the Maya world, Kaminaljuyu. At first glance, there is little in the modern cityscape to suggest what lies beneath. Traffic moves across wide avenues, buildings rise in dense clusters, and life continues above layers of accumulated history. Yet beneath this urban sprawl lies Kaminaljuyu, a vast pre-Columbian urban center that was once one of the most influential cities in the Maya highlands. The name Kaminaljuyu, meaning Hill of the Dead in the Quiche Maya language, reflects a landscape already shaped by memory and burial long before modern excavation began. The site consists of hundreds of mounds, platforms, and buried architectural complexes spread across what is now an expanded metropolitan region. These mounds are not natural hills, but the accumulated remains of centuries of construction, temples, residences, ceremonial platforms, and administrative structures layered over time. Archaeological evidence places the peak of Kaminaljuyu's development roughly between 800 BC and 250 AD, during the pre-classic period of Maya civilization. At its height, it was a major political and economic center in the highlands, controlling trade routes that connected the Pacific coast, central highlands, and lowland Maya regions. Obsidian, one of the most important materials in Mesoamerican economies, was extensively sourced, worked, and distributed from this region. Yet Kaminaljuyu is not easily reconstructed as a single, unified city. Instead, it appears as a shifting constellation of centers that rose, declined, and were rebuilt across centuries. Some areas show evidence of large ceremonial platforms and elite residences, while others suggest more decentralized habitation. The site resists a simple urban model, instead presenting a layered and evolving landscape of human organization. One of the most striking aspects of Kaminaljuyu is its monumental architecture, particularly its early use of massive earthworks and stone structures. These include pyramidal platforms and complex drainage systems designed to manage the region's seasonal rainfall and volcanic soil conditions. The engineering required to sustain such a city in a geologically active region raises questions about the level of coordination and knowledge present in early Maya societies. How did such a large urban center emerge in the highlands so early in Maya history? Mainstream archaeology suggests that Kaminaljuyu developed as part of broader regional processes of agricultural intensification, trade expansion, and social stratification. The fertile volcanic soils of the valley supported maize cultivation, allowing population growth and the emergence of elite classes who organized labor and construction. Yet even within this framework, Kaminaljuyu presents unresolved complexities. Unlike some later Maya cities with clearly visible dynastic inscriptions, Kaminaljuyu's written record is fragmented. Stelae and carved monuments exist, but many are eroded or stylistically transitional, reflecting early stages of Maya writing and iconography. This makes it difficult to reconstruct a continuous political history. The sculptures found at the site add another layer of intrigue. Some depict seated figures, rulers, or deities in elaborate headdresses, carved in styles that blend early Maya artistic traditions with influences from other Mesoamerican cultures, particularly Teotihuacan. This suggests that Kaminaljuyu was not isolated, but deeply embedded in long-distance cultural exchanges. In fact, evidence of interaction with Teotihuacan, located far in central Mexico, has been found in pottery styles, burial practices, and architectural elements. At certain points in its history, Kaminaljuyu appears to have been influenced or even partially integrated into broader pan-Mesoamerican networks of power and ideology. But the exact nature of this relationship remains debated. Was it diplomatic exchange, cultural influence, trade dependency, or something more politically direct? Some scholars propose that Kaminaljuyu may have served as a strategic intermediary between highland and lowland civilizations, controlling access to obsidian and other valuable resources. Others suggest that its significance shifted over time, rising and falling in response to environmental changes, trade realignments, and internal socio-political transformations. And yet, beneath these interpretations lies a quieter question. Why does Kaminaljuyu feel so incomplete in the archaeological record compared to other major Maya sites? Entire sectors remain buried beneath modern infrastructure, inaccessible to excavation. What has been uncovered is only a fraction of what once existed. The rest lies beneath streets, buildings, and layers of urban expansion that now define Guatemala City. This creates a unique archaeological paradox, a major ancient city that cannot be fully excavated without dismantling a modern capital. As a result, Kaminaljuyu exists in partial visibility, mapped, studied, and yet fundamentally incomplete in its revealed form. Some of the most intriguing discoveries come from burial contexts. Elite tombs containing jade objects, pottery, and finely crafted ornaments suggest complex social hierarchies. Jade, in particular, held profound symbolic significance in Maya culture, associated with life, fertility, and elite status. The presence of such materials indicates not only wealth, but also participation in shared ideological systems across Mesoamerica. Yet even these burials raise questions. Variations in burial styles suggest shifts in ritual practice over time. Some tombs are elaborate, others more modest. Some contain foreign objects, hinting at external connections. What changes in belief or political structure led to these variations? And how were these shifts experienced by the people who lived through them? The architectural layers of Kaminaljuyu also suggest cycles of construction, abandonment, and rebuilding. Entire platforms were covered over and new structures built on top, creating a dense stratigraphy of human activity. This repeated transformation of space suggests that the city was continuously reinterpreted by its inhabitants. But the reasons for these cycles are not always clear, whether driven by political change, environmental pressure, or ritual renewal. Walking through the partially excavated areas of Kaminaljuyu today, one encounters low mounds and exposed stone foundations emerging between modern structures. It is a landscape where ancient and contemporary life overlap, not in separation, but in direct physical proximity. The past is not distant here. It is embedded beneath everyday movement. And perhaps that is what makes Kaminaljuyu uniquely unsettling in its own quiet way. It is not a lost city in the traditional sense. It is a partially visible one, still active beneath the surface of modern life, still holding unanswered questions beneath layers of soil and concrete. So the reflection remains open, unresolved, and deeply human. How many ancient cities like Kaminaljuyu still exist beneath our feet? Not as ruins in distant deserts or remote islands, but directly beneath the places where we live today, waiting quietly for their stories to be fully understood, if they ever can be at all. From the buried layers of Kaminaljuyu, where an ancient Maya city still lies partially hidden beneath the modern rhythms of Guatemala City, the journey moves once more across continents and landscapes. The transition feels almost like a descent and ascent at the same time, down through time, and then upward into a dramatically different terrain. In the southern reaches of Africa, where rivers carve through arid plains and acacia trees stand against wide skies, rises a solitary sandstone hill that once held one of the earliest centers of complex society in the region, Mapungubwe Hill. At first sight, Mapungubwe Hill does not immediately reveal its historical weight. It is a natural-looking formation of rock and earth, rising above the surrounding savanna near the confluence of the Limpopo and Shashe rivers, in what is now northern South Africa. The land around it stretches outward in open plains, shaped by seasonal floods, dry winds, and long cycles of ecological change. But atop this hill, and within its slopes, lies evidence of a society that flourished nearly 1,000 years ago. Mapungubwe emerged around 1075 AD and reached its peak between approximately 1200 and 1220 AD. It is widely recognized as one of the earliest known complex kingdoms in southern Africa, predating and in many ways foreshadowing the rise of later regional centers such as Great Zimbabwe. Archaeological evidence reveals a highly stratified society with clear distinctions between ruling elites and the broader population. At the summit of Mapungubwe Hill, archaeologists uncovered what is often referred to as a royal burial site. Here, individuals of high status were interred with gold artifacts, beads, and other valuable objects. The most famous of these finds is the golden rhinoceros, a small but exquisitely crafted figure made from thin sheets of gold applied over a wooden core. Alongside it were other animal figurines and ceremonial items that suggest symbolic systems of authority and power. The placement of elite burials at the top of the hill, while common settlements were located below in the surrounding valley, reflects a clear spatial hierarchy. The landscape itself appears to have been organized in accordance with social structure. Elevation was not merely geographical, it was symbolic. Those at the summit occupied both physical and ideological height above the rest of society. Yet even with this clear structural understanding, Mapungubwe raises deeper questions that are not easily resolved. Mainstream archaeology interprets Mapungubwe as a political and economic center that developed through control of trade networks connecting inland Africa with the Indian Ocean world. Goods such as gold, ivory, and animal products moved from the interior toward coastal trading ports, where they were exchanged for glass beads, ceramics, and other imported materials from as far as Asia and the Middle East. This network of exchange suggests that Mapungubwe was not an isolated kingdom, but part of a vast interconnected system of commerce and cultural interaction. However, the mechanisms of this trade, and the social processes behind it, remain only partially understood. How exactly did goods move across such distances in a landscape without written records from the kingdom itself? What forms of communication, trust, and organization sustained these exchanges over generations? The absence of indigenous written documentation from Mapungubwe adds another layer of mystery. While archaeological evidence provides material insight into daily life, ritual practice, and social structure, it does not offer direct accounts of belief systems or political narratives. The voices of the people who lived here are present only indirectly, through objects and spatial arrangements. One of the most intriguing aspects of Mapungubwe is the apparent emergence of social stratification. Evidence suggests a clear separation between elite groups and common inhabitants, with elites residing at elevated positions and buried with high-value goods. This raises questions about the development of hierarchy in early southern African societies. Was this structure the result of gradual internal evolution, or did external influences play a role in shaping political organization? Some researchers have explored the possibility that Mapungubwe's development was influenced by broader Indian Ocean trade dynamics, where contact with distant regions introduced new forms of wealth accumulation and symbolic expression. Glass beads found at the site, for example, originate from regions as far as India and Southeast Asia. Their presence suggests not only trade, but participation in a far-reaching exchange system that connected multiple continents. Yet even as these connections are established, the internal worldview of Mapungubwe remains elusive. What did gold represent to those who shaped it into animal forms and burial offerings? Was it purely a symbol of wealth and power, or did it hold spiritual significance tied to leadership and ancestral authority? In more speculative interpretations, Mapungubwe Hill has been viewed not only as a political center, but as a landscape of symbolic geography. The elevation of the hill, its visibility across the surrounding plains, and its separation from everyday settlement areas have led some to suggest that the site was designed to reflect cosmological ideas, where rulers occupied a position closer to ancestral or spiritual realms. While archaeology does not confirm such interpretations in metaphysical terms, the consistent pattern of elevated elite burial sites across multiple southern African cultures suggests that verticality held symbolic importance. Height may have represented more than status. It may have represented connection. The golden artifacts themselves continue to invite reflection. Gold is a material that does not corrode or decay, and its reflective surface has long been associated with permanence and transformation in many cultures. The craftsmanship of the Mapungubwe figurines suggests not only technical skill, but intentional symbolic expression. Why choose animals such as rhinoceroses, cattle, and other fauna as representations of authority? What meanings were embedded in these forms that are no longer fully accessible? Mapungubwe was eventually abandoned around the 14th century AD, though the reasons remain a subject of study. Environmental changes, shifting trade routes, and political transformations are often cited as contributing factors. As attention moved toward new centers, such as Great Zimbabwe, Mapungubwe gradually faded from active occupation. The hill remained, but its political and ceremonial significance diminished over time. What remains today is a carefully preserved archaeological landscape, recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Excavations have revealed not only burial sites, but also pottery, tools, and settlement remains that paint a picture of a complex and dynamic society. Yet even with these discoveries, much of the site remains unexcavated or only partially understood. Standing on Mapungubwe Hill today, one is surrounded by silence and wide horizons. The Limpopo River flows nearby, marking a natural boundary that once connected rather than divided regions. The wind moves across the plains, carrying no trace of the gold, trade, or ceremony that once defined this place. And yet, beneath the surface, the hill still holds layers of human presence. Burials, artifacts, and structures that have not yet been fully revealed. And so the question remains, open and unresolved. How many early centers of civilization like Mapungubwe existed across the African continent, shaping complex societies through trade, symbolism, and landscape, only to be partially forgotten, their full histories still resting quietly beneath the earth, waiting for further discovery? From the elevated silence of Mapungubwe Hill, where ancient African kingdoms once shaped power through gold, landscape, and vertical symbolism, the journey moves once more across continents and into a very different kind of terrain. The heat and savanna give way to cooler air, rolling green hills, and chalky earth shaped by wind and centuries of erosion. In the south of England, within the county of Dorset, rises one of the largest and most complex prehistoric hill forts in Europe, Maiden Castle. At first approach, Maiden Castle does not appear as a singular structure, but as a vast series of earthworks unfolding across a long chalk ridge. From a distance, it resembles a layered wave frozen in landform, multiple concentric banks and ditches rising and falling in rhythmic sequence. The scale is immediately striking. This is not a small defensive enclosure. It is an engineered landscape, shaped and reshaped over centuries, its form expanding outward in successive stages like a memory written in earth. Maiden Castle's earliest origins date back to the Neolithic period, around 4000 BC, when a simple causewayed enclosure was first constructed on the site. Over time, this early structure was transformed during the Iron Age, particularly between roughly 600 BC and 43 AD, into one of the most formidable hill forts in Britain. Each phase of construction added new layers of ramparts and ditches, increasing both the physical scale and the symbolic presence of the site. From above, the fort's layout appears almost organic yet deliberately structured. Multiple entrances pierce the earthworks, some aligned in ways that suggest controlled access points rather than random openings. The inner enclosure sits elevated at the core, surrounded by progressively larger defensive rings. The engineering required to move and shape such vast quantities of chalk and soil without modern tools speaks to sustained communal effort over generations. Mainstream archaeology interprets Maiden Castle primarily as a fortified settlement and regional center for Iron Age communities. It likely served multiple functions: habitation, defense, trade, and possibly ceremonial gatherings. The scale of its fortifications suggests a society capable of organizing large labor forces and maintaining territorial control over surrounding farmland and resources. Yet even within this practical framework, Maiden Castle raises quiet and persistent questions. Why was such monumental effort invested in expanding and reinforcing this particular hilltop over such a long period of time? The transformation from a relatively simple Neolithic enclosure into a massive Iron Age fortification suggests not only continuity, but repeated reimagining of the site's purpose. Was it purely strategic, or did the location itself carry a significance that transcended military logic? The Iron Age period in Britain was marked by shifting tribal territories, increasing social complexity, and eventually contact with Roman expansion. Maiden Castle appears to have been active during this turbulent time, potentially serving as a stronghold for local groups in the Dorset region. Archaeological evidence indicates domestic activity within the fort: roundhouses, storage pits, and artifacts associated with daily life such as pottery, tools, and agricultural remains. But there is also evidence of conflict. Excavations have uncovered human remains with signs of trauma, suggesting episodes of violence, possibly linked to warfare or internal disputes. Roman historical accounts describe resistance in southern Britain during the expansion into the region, and it is often suggested that Maiden Castle may have been involved in such confrontations in the decades surrounding the Roman conquest in 43 AD. Still, the archaeological record does not provide a complete narrative of these events. It shows traces of occupation and destruction, but not the full sequence of decisions, movements, and motivations that shaped them. One of the most striking aspects of Maiden Castle is its sheer visibility in the landscape. Even today, the earthworks dominate the surrounding countryside, visible from great distances. This raises a broader question. Was the fort designed not only for defense, but also for display? In many ancient societies, monumental construction served dual purposes: practical protection and symbolic communication of power, identity, and territorial presence. The effort required to maintain such a structure over centuries implies a society deeply invested in place. Each expansion phase represents not just engineering, but a decision to reinforce the importance of this hill in relation to surrounding land and communities. Yet, what exactly made this location so significant? Some interpretations suggest that Maiden Castle may have held symbolic or ritual importance in addition to its defensive role. The alignment of certain entrances and internal spaces has led some researchers to consider whether movement through the fort was structured in ways that reflected social or ceremonial patterns. While there is no definitive evidence of large-scale ritual use, the idea that space within the fort carried layered meaning is difficult to dismiss entirely. In broader Iron Age Britain, hill forts are not uniform. Some appear heavily fortified and densely occupied, while others show limited evidence of long-term habitation. This variability suggests that their function was not fixed, but adaptable, shaped by regional needs, social organization, and perhaps shifting cultural values. Maiden Castle, with its exceptional scale, may represent one of the most developed expressions of this architectural tradition. Yet even here, interpretation remains partial. We can map the earthworks, analyze artifacts, and reconstruct possible settlement patterns. But the lived experience of the people who built and occupied this space remains largely inaccessible. What did it feel like to move through these layered defenses? To stand at the center of the enclosure, surrounded by earth rising in every direction? The relationship between construction and landscape also invites reflection. The hill itself predates the fort, shaped by natural geological processes over millennia. The builders did not create the hill, they transformed it. This interplay between natural form and human intervention creates a hybrid landscape where Earth becomes both material and meaning. Some scholars have suggested that hill forts like Maiden Castle may have functioned not only as defensive structures, but as expressions of collective identity during periods of social tension. In this view, the act of building and expanding the fort was as significant as its use. It reinforced cohesion, hierarchy, and shared purpose within the community. Others caution against over-interpreting symbolism, emphasizing the practical realities of Iron Age life, resource management, territorial defense, and agricultural control. Yet even within these practical frameworks, the scale of investment at Maiden Castle continues to stand out. The final phase of occupation appears to coincide with the Roman expansion into Britain. Archaeological evidence suggests that the site may have experienced destruction or abandonment during this period, though the exact circumstances remain debated. After this point, Maiden Castle gradually ceased to function as an active settlement, becoming instead a monumental landscape feature, visible but no longer inhabited. Today, walking across the ramparts, one moves along contours shaped by thousands of years of human activity. The earthworks rise and fall like waves frozen in soil, and the wind moves freely across the exposed ridges. There is no sound of settlement, no movement of daily life, only the vast structure of the fort itself, still holding its form against time. And yet, even in its silence, Maiden Castle does not feel empty. It feels continuous, as if the decisions, conflicts, and movements of its past inhabitants are still embedded in the soil beneath each step. So the question remains, as it does across so many ancient landscapes, was Maiden Castle simply a defensive stronghold shaped by necessity, or does its immense scale and enduring presence suggest something deeper about how Iron Age communities understood land, identity, and the act of building itself, something that has not yet been fully recovered from the earth that still holds it? From the sweeping earthworks of Maiden Castle, where Iron Age communities shaped entire hills into layered expressions of defense and identity, the narrative moves once again, this time across continents, across seas, and into a landscape where history itself seems repeatedly written and overwritten by conflict, settlement, and belief. The terrain shifts from chalk ridges to fertile valleys, from northern Europe to the eastern Mediterranean. Here, in what is now northern Palestine, lies one of the most archaeologically dense and historically charged sites in the ancient world, Megiddo. At first glance, Megiddo appears as a modest archaeological mound rising above the Jezreel Valley. It is not visually imposing in the way of towering cliffs or dramatic mountain citadels. Yet beneath its quiet profile lies a stratified accumulation of human occupation stretching back thousands of years. This is not a single city, but a layered archive of cities, built, destroyed, and rebuilt in succession over millennia. The site is known in archaeological terms as a tell, an artificial mound formed by repeated cycles of habitation and collapse. Each layer represents a distinct period of construction, destruction, and renewal. Excavations have revealed more than 20 major occupational layers, spanning from the Neolithic period through the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and into later historical phases. Megiddo's strategic importance is immediately clear from its geography. It sits at a critical junction controlling access between the coastal plains and inland highlands, as well as routes connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia. In the ancient world, this made it a point of convergence for trade, armies, and empires. Whoever controlled Megiddo controlled movement across one of the most important corridors in the ancient Near East. This strategic position explains why the site appears repeatedly in ancient records, and why it became a focal point for military campaigns across different eras. Egyptian pharaohs, Canaanite city-states, and later regional powers all left their mark on this landscape. It is one of the few sites where archaeology and ancient written records intersect so densely that the ground itself becomes a cross-referenced archive. One of the most famous historical references to Megiddo comes from Egyptian inscriptions describing the campaign of Pharaoh Thutmose III in the 15th century BC. The Battle of Megiddo is often cited as one of the earliest recorded military engagements in history, with detailed accounts of strategy, siege, and victory preserved in temple inscriptions. Archaeological evidence of fortifications and destruction layers at the site is often connected to this event, though the exact correlation between text and material record remains a subject of careful interpretation. In later periods, Megiddo continued to function as a fortified administrative center under various regional powers, including the Israelites and Assyrians. Each phase of occupation left behind distinct architectural styles, pottery traditions, and urban layouts. The result is a deeply complex stratigraphy in which entire cities rest directly on top of earlier cities, sometimes separated by only thin layers of soil and debris. Yet, what makes Megiddo particularly compelling is not only its historical density, but the way in which its physical structure reflects cycles of destruction and renewal. Fortification walls were repeatedly rebuilt, gates were redesigned, palaces were constructed over earlier civic structures. The city was never static. It was continuously redefined by those who controlled it. Among the most striking archaeological discoveries at Megiddo are its monumental gateways and administrative complexes. The Iron Age gate systems, in particular, reveal sophisticated urban planning. Some gates feature multiple chambers, suggesting controlled access and security mechanisms designed to regulate movement into the city. These structures indicate a society capable of organized labor, engineering knowledge, and centralized authority. But beneath these visible achievements lies a more complex question. Why does Megiddo show such a persistent pattern of destruction layers? Archaeologists have identified multiple instances where the city was violently destroyed and subsequently rebuilt. Fire layers, collapsed structures, and abrupt abandonment phases suggest episodes of conflict or catastrophe repeated across centuries. Mainstream archaeology interprets these patterns as the result of Megiddo's strategic vulnerability. Situated at a crossroads of competing powers, the city would have been repeatedly caught in regional conflicts, shifting alliances, and imperial expansions. Its destruction layers reflect its role as a contested space rather than a stable urban center. Yet even within this explanation, the intensity and repetition of destruction invite deeper reflection. Few sites in the ancient world exhibit such a consistent rhythm of collapse and renewal over such a long period of time. Why was this location so persistently rebuilt, even after repeated devastation? What sustained its importance across shifting political landscapes? Some interpretations suggest that Megiddo's significance was not only strategic, but also symbolic. In ancient Near Eastern thought, cities often carried meanings beyond their physical function. A city located at a crossroads could represent more than trade and military advantage. It could symbolize transition, threshold, and convergence between regions and cultures. In this context, Megiddo's repeated rebuilding may reflect not only practical necessity, but enduring cultural and ideological importance. It was not simply a place to control movement, but a place that embodied movement itself. This symbolic dimension becomes even more complex when considering later historical and literary references. In various traditions, Megiddo becomes associated with large-scale conflict imagery, transformed from a physical location into a conceptual landscape of final confrontation. While archaeology does not engage with symbolic prophecy, the persistence of Megiddo in cultural memory across millennia adds another layer to its identity. Within the archaeological record itself, however, the material evidence remains grounded. Pottery fragments, tools, inscriptions, and architectural remains form the basis of reconstruction. These artifacts reveal daily life, administration, storage, agriculture, and craft production. Yet they also hint at abrupt interruptions in continuity, moments where normal activity ceased and structures were left in disarray. One of the most significant architectural features uncovered at Megiddo is its series of elaborate water systems. Deep underground tunnels and shafts were constructed to secure access to water sources during times of siege. These engineering works reflect not only technical skill, but an awareness of prolonged vulnerability. The very existence of such systems suggests a society accustomed to anticipating conflict. Descending into these subterranean passages today, one encounters carefully cut stone steps leading deep below the surface. The air becomes cooler, the sound of the outside world fades, and the sense of time shifts. These tunnels represent a hidden dimension of the city, one not visible from the surface, but essential to its survival. And yet, even here, questions remain. How were such complex engineering projects coordinated across generations? What knowledge systems guided their construction and maintenance? And how did the inhabitants of Megiddo perceive their own city as it repeatedly rose from destruction? Archaeology can trace sequences of occupation, but it cannot fully reconstruct the lived experience of continuity through repeated collapse. The emotional and psychological dimensions of rebuilding a city on top of its own ruins remain largely inaccessible. As excavation continues, Megiddo reveals itself not as a single story, but as a layered accumulation of human responses to geography, conflict, and time. Each layer is both ending and beginning. Each reconstruction is both memory and reinvention. And so the question lingers, embedded in the very structure of the mound itself. Was Megiddo simply a strategically important city repeatedly caught in the currents of ancient empire? Or does its extraordinary sequence of destruction and renewal suggest something deeper about how ancient societies understood place, permanence, and the meaning of rebuilding on ground that never truly stopped holding the weight of its past? From the stratified depths of Megiddo, where ancient cities rise and fall in layered succession like geological memory, the journey moves once more across the eastern Mediterranean. The landscape shifts again, this time toward the rugged terrain of southern Greece, where limestone mountains rise sharply from the earth and the wind moves through valleys that have witnessed the earliest expressions of Greek civilization. Here, on a fortified hill overlooking the Argolid Plain, stands one of the most influential centers of the Bronze Age Aegean world, the Mycenae Citadel. At first approach, Mycenae does not present itself as a city in the modern sense, but as a powerful silhouette carved into stone and elevation. Massive limestone walls rise in irregular but deliberate formations, enclosing a summit that once served as the heart of a ruling elite. The citadel is not hidden within the landscape. It dominates it. From its elevated position, it commands wide views across fertile plains and distant mountain passes, suggesting a deliberate choice of location that combines both strategic advantage and symbolic authority. The most striking feature of Mycenae is its cyclopean masonry, the enormous limestone blocks used to construct its defensive walls. Some stones are so large and irregular that later Greek tradition attributed their construction to the Cyclopes, mythical one-eyed giants, believing that only such beings could have moved stones of such immense size. While archaeology explains the construction through Bronze Age engineering techniques and coordinated labor, the visual impact of these walls continues to evoke a sense of overwhelming scale and effort. The citadel reached its height between approximately 1600 and 1100 BC, during what is known as the Mycenaean civilization. This was a period of emerging palatial states in mainland Greece, characterized by centralized administration, fortified centers, and extensive trade networks that connected the Aegean world with Egypt, Anatolia, and the wider eastern Mediterranean. Within the walls of Mycenae stood a complex palace system, administrative buildings, workshops, and elite residences. Archaeological excavations have revealed storage rooms filled with clay tablets written in Linear B script, the earliest known form of Greek writing. These tablets record inventories, transactions, and administrative details, offering a glimpse into a highly organized bureaucratic system. Yet despite this administrative clarity, Mycenae retains an atmosphere of partial opacity. The written records are functional rather than narrative. They tell us what was stored, distributed, or controlled, but not the full stories of the people who lived within the citadel. The emotional, cultural, and ideological dimensions of Mycenaean life remain largely inferred rather than directly recorded. One of the most iconic features of Mycenae is the Lion Gate, the monumental entrance to the citadel. Flanked by two stylized lion figures carved in relief above a massive lintel stone, the gate serves as both a physical and symbolic threshold. It marks the transition from the outer landscape into the controlled interior of the citadel. The lions themselves, though stylized, convey a sense of guardianship and authority, reinforcing the idea of power embedded in architecture. Beyond the gate lies the central palace complex, where administrative and ceremonial activities would have taken place. The organization of space suggests a society structured around a ruling elite, often referred to in later Greek tradition as the kingly or wanax system. While the term itself comes from later linguistic reconstruction, it reflects the presence of centralized authority during the Mycenaean period. Surrounding the citadel are the remains of shaft graves and later tholos tombs, large beehive-shaped burial structures constructed with remarkable precision. The shaft graves, discovered in the grave circles within Mycenae, contained rich burial goods including gold masks, weapons, jewelry, and finely crafted ceremonial objects. The most famous of these is the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, a gold funerary mask discovered in one of the shaft graves, though it predates the legendary figure traditionally associated with the Trojan War. These burial finds suggest a society deeply invested in status, memory, and material expression of power. Gold objects, in particular, indicate both wealth accumulation and symbolic importance. The craftsmanship demonstrates advanced metallurgical skill, as well as access to trade networks that supplied precious materials from distant regions. Yet even with these discoveries, many aspects of Mycenae remain open to interpretation. The relationship between archaeological evidence and later Greek mythology is particularly complex. Ancient epic traditions, such as those later recorded in the Iliad and Odyssey, place Mycenae at the center of a legendary age of heroes, kings, and expansive military campaigns. Whether these narratives preserve distant memories of Mycenaean society or are primarily mythological constructions remains a subject of ongoing discussion. What is clear is that Mycenae occupied a central position in the cultural imagination of later Greek civilization. It was remembered not simply as a place, but as an origin point, a symbol of an earlier heroic age whose material remains still shaped the landscape centuries after its decline. The collapse of Mycenaean civilization around 1200 BC marks one of the most significant transitions in Aegean prehistory. Many palatial centers were destroyed or abandoned, administrative systems collapsed, and written record-keeping ceased for several centuries. The reasons for this widespread disruption are still debated, with theories ranging from internal social instability and environmental stress to external invasions or complex systemic collapse. At Mycenae itself, evidence of destruction layers suggests episodes of fire and structural damage, followed by partial reoccupation in later periods. Yet the citadel never returned to its former prominence. It remained a powerful ruin, still visible and still culturally significant, but no longer functioning as a major administrative center. Walking through the remains of Mycenae today, one encounters a landscape shaped by both monumental ambition and gradual erosion. The stone walls still stand, but they are no longer enclosed within a living city. The palace structures exist in foundations and fragments. The tombs lie beneath the surface, partially excavated, partially hidden. There is a sense that the site exists simultaneously in two temporal states, one grounded in its Bronze Age peak, and another defined by centuries of memory, myth, and archaeological recovery. The physical remains are only part of the story. The rest is constructed through interpretation, comparison, and the careful reconstruction of fragmented evidence. And yet, even with extensive excavation and scholarship, Mycenae does not fully resolve into clarity. Questions remain about the nature of its political organization, the extent of its external connections, and the lived experience of its inhabitants within the citadel's imposing walls. What did it mean to inhabit a space so heavily fortified, so elevated above the surrounding landscape? Was Mycenae experienced as a secure center of power, or as a place constantly shaped by the awareness of vulnerability and external pressure? The Lion Gate still stands as a threshold between worlds, not only between exterior and interior space, but between the known and the partially reconstructed. It marks an entry point into a civilization that is both materially present and historically fragmented. And so the reflection persists, quietly embedded in stone and shadow. How much of Mycenae has been recovered through archaeology, and how much of it remains locked within the gaps between artifacts, waiting not for discovery alone, but for interpretation that may never fully close the distance between material remains and the lived reality of an ancient citadel that once defined an entire age of the Aegean world? From the towering stone walls of Mycenae, where Bronze Age power was carved into limestone and preserved in myth as much as in archaeology, the journey crosses continents once again, moving away from the Mediterranean world and into the vast, silent landscapes of North America. The transition is not immediate. It feels like a widening of space itself, as if the narrative steps back to take in an entirely different scale of human adaptation. Here, in the high desert plateaus of what is now southwestern Colorado, a different kind of ancient architecture emerges, one shaped not by stone blocks or citadels, but by cliffs, alcoves, and the living rock of the earth itself, the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings. At first approach, Mesa Verde does not reveal its complexity. The landscape appears as a vast expanse of rugged mesas, flat-topped mountains rising above deep canyons carved by wind and water over millions of years. Juniper trees and pinyon pines scatter across the terrain, their presence subtle against the pale sandstone. From a distance, the cliffs seem almost empty, uninhabited, still governed by geological time rather than human history. And yet, as one moves closer, the stone begins to change character. Within the sheer cliff faces, recessed alcoves appear, natural formations shaped by erosion, water seepage, and the slow collapse of softer rock layers. It is within these sheltered spaces that one of the most remarkable architectural traditions in North America was created. The Mesa Verde cliff dwellings were constructed primarily by the ancestral Puebloans between approximately 600 AD and 1300 AD, reaching their most complex forms in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. These were not isolated shelters, but entire communities built into the natural recesses of the cliffs. Stone masonry walls were carefully fitted into the alcoves, forming rooms, plazas, storage areas, and ceremonial structures known as kivas. Perhaps the most iconic of these settlements is Cliff Palace, a vast complex containing over 150 rooms and more than 20 kivas, built within a single sheltered alcove. Other sites, such as Balcony House and Spruce Tree House, reveal similarly sophisticated construction, adapted precisely to the contours of the rock. The engineering required to construct these dwellings is immediately evident. Sandstone blocks were shaped and stacked without mortar in many areas, while in others, clay and organic materials were used to bind structures together. Wooden beams, transported from forests located miles away, were integrated into ceilings and floors. The result is a fusion of human design and natural architecture, where the cliff itself becomes part of the dwelling. Mainstream archaeology interprets Mesa Verde as the culmination of centuries of adaptation by ancestral Puebloan communities to the environmental conditions of the Colorado Plateau. Earlier settlements in open plains gradually shifted toward more defensible and resource-efficient locations within canyon systems. The cliff dwellings represent the final phase of this long trajectory, combining agricultural knowledge, architectural innovation, and social organization. Yet even within this framework of adaptation, Mesa Verde raises questions that resist simple resolution. Why did entire communities move into cliffside environments in the first place? The traditional explanation involves environmental stress, periods of drought, resource scarcity, and population pressure that encouraged settlement in more protected and strategically advantageous locations. The cliffs offered natural defense, shade, and proximity to water sources in canyon floors. But this explanation, while grounded in evidence, does not fully account for the intensity and scale of construction within such seemingly inaccessible spaces. Building in cliff alcoves required extraordinary effort, transporting materials upward, stabilizing structures against rock faces, and maintaining daily life in vertical terrain that is physically demanding even today. Some researchers suggest that the move into cliffs may have also carried social or symbolic dimensions. The vertical separation between canyon floor and cliff dwelling could reflect distinctions in social organization, ritual practice, or cosmological understanding. Living within the rock itself may have represented not only practical adaptation, but also a redefinition of space and identity. Within the cliff dwellings, archaeological evidence reveals complex community life. Kivas, circular subterranean rooms, appear to have served ceremonial or communal functions. Their design, partially underground and often featuring central fire pits and ventilation shafts, suggests carefully structured gatherings, possibly linked to ritual cycles or social cohesion. The layout of rooms around plazas and communal areas indicates that these were not isolated shelters, but integrated villages. Storage rooms contained remnants of maize, beans, and squash, the agricultural foundation of Puebloan life. Grinding stones, pottery fragments, and woven materials point to daily domestic activity carried out within the cliff walls. Yet, even with this detailed reconstruction, the lived experience of Mesa Verde remains partially obscured. One of the most striking aspects of the site is its sudden abandonment around the late 13th century A.D. Within a relatively short span of time, the cliff dwellings were vacated and the population relocated to other regions, particularly toward the south and east, where later Pueblo communities would continue cultural traditions in new environments. The reasons for this migration remain a subject of ongoing study. Archaeological evidence suggests a combination of prolonged drought, resource depletion, and possible social pressures. Tree ring data from the region indicates periods of reduced rainfall, which would have significantly impacted agricultural productivity. In such conditions, sustaining large populations in cliff environments may have become increasingly difficult. Yet the abruptness of the departure still invites reflection. The dwellings were not destroyed or dismantled. They were left largely intact, as if life simply moved elsewhere rather than collapsing in place. Cooking tools, storage vessels, and domestic spaces remained behind, gradually becoming part of the archaeological record rather than immediate ruins of conflict or catastrophe. What does it mean for a society to leave behind such carefully constructed spaces without visible signs of destruction? Was this a planned migration, a gradual relocation, or a response to conditions that required rapid movement? Some interpretations suggest that Mesa Verde represents not a collapse, but a transformation, a shift in settlement strategy rather than disappearance. The descendants of these communities are still present today among Pueblo peoples in the American Southwest, maintaining cultural and linguistic continuity that connects past and present in ways that archaeology alone cannot fully capture. Still, the cliff dwellings themselves remain suspended in a kind of temporal stillness. The stone walls stand where they were placed centuries ago. Doorways open into empty rooms. Kivas descend into silence. The cliffs hold both architecture and absence simultaneously. There is also the question of perception. Why build within cliffs at all, when open land was available nearby? Was the choice driven purely by necessity, or did the cliffs themselves hold meaning beyond shelter? Across many cultures, elevated or enclosed natural spaces are associated with transition, protection, or sacred geography. Whether such associations applied here in a formalized way remains uncertain, but the spatial logic of Mesa Verde continues to provoke interpretation. Walking through these sites today, one moves through a landscape that feels both inhabited and withdrawn. The dwellings are accessible, yet difficult. Open, yet enclosed. They exist within rock rather than upon it, creating a sense of architecture emerging from geology rather than imposed upon it. And so the question remains, quietly embedded in stone and shadow. Were the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings simply a brilliant environmental adaptation by ancestral Puebloan communities responding to climatic pressures, or do they also reflect a deeper relationship between people and landscape, one in which dwelling within the earth itself carried meanings that have not yet been fully recovered from the silence of the cliffs? From the suspended silence of Mesa Verde, where ancestral Puebloan communities carved entire settlements into living rock and then quietly moved on, the journey crosses the breadth of the Atlantic once again. The desert heat fades, replaced by wind, salt, and cold northern waters. The narrative shifts into a different kind of isolation, one shaped not by cliffs and canyons, but by sea, storm, and stone-bound shorelines. In the far north of Scotland, on the windswept Orkney Islands, lies one of the most complete Neolithic settlements ever uncovered in Europe, Skara Brae. At first approach, Skara Brae does not appear as a monument in the traditional sense. There are no towering walls, no dramatic silhouettes against the sky. Instead, what emerges from the grassy dunes is something far more subtle, a low cluster of stone structures partially embedded in the earth, their outlines revealed only because time and weather slowly exposed them from beneath centuries of sand. The settlement appears almost as if it is emerging rather than decaying, as though the ground itself has chosen to reveal what it once protected. Skara Brae dates to approximately 3,180 BC to 2,500 BC, making it older than Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids of Egypt. It belongs to the Neolithic period, a time when human communities across the British Isles were transitioning from mobile lifestyles to more permanent, settled forms of habitation. Yet Skara Brae stands apart from many other Neolithic sites due to its extraordinary state of preservation. The settlement consists of a series of interconnected stone-built houses, arranged in a compact cluster along a gently sloping shoreline. Each dwelling is remarkably uniform in design. Small, low rooms constructed from carefully fitted flagstones, with central hearths, stone beds built into the walls, and storage compartments carved directly into the masonry. Even stone furniture survives, dressers, shelves, and seating all integrated into the architecture itself. What makes Skara Brae so remarkable is not only its age, but the completeness of its domestic environment. It is not a ruin in the usual sense. It is a preserved moment of daily life. The arrangement of objects within the houses suggests careful organization. Pottery placed in storage niches, tools left near hearths, and sleeping areas defined by stone slabs. The impression is one of sudden abandonment, yet without visible evidence of destruction or catastrophe. Mainstream archaeology explains Skara Brae as a small farming and fishing community that adapted to the harsh coastal environment of Neolithic Orkney. The structures were likely covered with organic roofing materials, possibly driftwood, turf, and animal skins, forming insulated dwellings capable of withstanding strong Atlantic winds. The choice of stone as a primary building material was both practical and environmental, as wood was scarce in the region. Over time, shifting sand dunes are believed to have gradually buried the settlement, preserving it beneath layers of sediment until a severe storm in the 19th century exposed parts of the site once again. Excavations led by archaeologists such as William Watt and later Vere Gordon Childe revealed the full extent of the village, bringing Skara Brae into modern archaeological understanding. Yet even with this framework, the site retains an atmosphere that invites deeper reflection. One of the most intriguing aspects of Skara Brae is its uniformity. Unlike many later settlements, there is little visible evidence of social hierarchy in its architecture. The houses are similar in size and structure, suggesting a relatively egalitarian community. There are no large central temples, no clearly defined elite residences, and no monumental structures dominating the landscape. What does this imply about social organization in Neolithic Orkney? Was Skara Brae a deliberately equal society, or does the archaeological record simply preserve a community whose internal differences were expressed in ways that have not survived materially? The layout of the village also raises questions. The houses are connected by narrow passageways, forming a tightly clustered network. This suggests a high degree of communal integration, where movement between dwellings was controlled and structured. Entry points to the settlement appear to have been limited and possibly shared, hinting at a community that balanced privacy with collective security. Some researchers have suggested that Skara Brae may have functioned not only as a domestic settlement, but also as a site with ritual or symbolic dimensions. The presence of carefully arranged stone furniture and the consistent orientation of interior spaces have led to interpretations that domestic life and ceremonial life may not have been strictly separated in Neolithic society. The stone beds, for example, are often positioned in ways that suggest deliberate alignment within each structure. Storage niches and dressers are uniformly placed, indicating shared architectural conventions. Was this purely practical standardization, or did it reflect shared cultural or symbolic principles that governed how space should be inhabited? Another striking feature is the absence of wood in the preserved architecture. While this is often explained by environmental scarcity, it also creates a uniquely stone-bound aesthetic that shapes how we perceive the site today. The furniture, walls, and structural elements feel almost sculpted rather than constructed, as if the village was carved from the earth itself rather than assembled upon it. Outside the houses, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of tools, pottery fragments, and bone artifacts. These objects point to a subsistence lifestyle based on farming, animal husbandry, and coastal resource gathering. Shellfish remains and fish bones suggest a diet closely tied to the surrounding marine environment. Yet despite these material insights, the emotional and social dimensions of life at Skara Brae remain partially inaccessible. What did daily life feel like in a place constantly exposed to wind, salt, and shifting weather? How did communities organize themselves within such confined, interconnected spaces? The suddenness with which Skara Brae appears in the archaeological record, and the gradual way it disappears beneath sand, creates a sense of temporal ambiguity. There is no clear narrative of destruction. Instead, there is accumulation, burial, and rediscovery. The village does not end in fire or conflict, but in silence and sediment. This raises a broader question about how we interpret abandonment in prehistoric contexts. Was Skara Brae gradually deserted due to environmental changes, shifting resources, or social transformation? Or was it simply one of many settlements in a dynamic landscape where habitation moved fluidly over time? Some interpretations suggest that changes in climate and coastal conditions may have made the site less viable, prompting relocation. Others propose that cultural shifts led to new settlement patterns elsewhere in Orkney, leaving Skara Brae to be slowly reclaimed by dunes. Neither explanation fully captures the sense of stillness the site conveys today. Walking through the excavated remains, one moves through rooms that are both open and enclosed. The low walls frame spaces that feel intimate yet exposed to the elements. The stone furniture remains fixed in place, as if waiting for return that never came. There is no sense of dramatic collapse, only the quiet persistence of structure without presence. And perhaps that is what makes Skara Brae so compelling within the wider story of ancient archaeology. It does not present itself as a site of grand destruction or monumental achievement, but as a carefully organized world of everyday life, preserved almost intact beneath the earth. So the question remains, lingering in the wind that still moves across the Orkney coastline. Was Skara Brae simply a Neolithic village shaped by environmental necessity and gradual abandonment, or does its remarkable preservation and spatial coherence suggest something deeper about how early communities understood dwelling, permanence, and the fragile boundary between habitation and disappearance in a landscape that never stops changing? From the wind-carved stone houses of Skara Brae, where Neolithic life was preserved beneath sand and silence, the journey moves once again across oceans and hemispheres. The cold Atlantic gives way to dense tropical heat, and the pale stone architecture of northern Europe fades into a world of towering forests, limestone plains, and hidden cities swallowed by jungle. Deep in the lowland rainforest of the Yucatan Peninsula, near the borderlands of modern-day Campeche, lies one of the largest and most complex ancient Maya cities ever discovered, Calakmul. At first, Calakmul does not reveal itself easily. Unlike sites that rise from open terrain, this city is concealed beneath an overwhelming canopy of green. Ceiba trees stretch upward through mist and humidity, their roots entangled with centuries of buried stone. The jungle does not merely surround Calakmul, it absorbs it. Only when one moves deeper into the forest does the shape of something artificial begin to emerge. Faint rises in the ground, geometric breaks in the natural chaos of vegetation, and then, gradually, the unmistakable outlines of pyramids rising above the canopy. Calakmul was once a major political and cultural center of the Maya civilization, flourishing particularly between approximately 500 AD and 900 AD during the Classic period. It was one of the dominant powers in the Maya lowlands, rivaling cities such as Tikal in influence, military reach, and architectural ambition. At its height, Calakmul was not an isolated city, but the center of a vast regional network, exerting control over smaller settlements and engaging in long-standing political rivalries that shaped the history of the Maya world. The city itself is immense. Archaeological surveys have identified more than 6,000 structures within its boundaries, including pyramids, palaces, residential complexes, and administrative buildings. 2 massive pyramids dominate the site, rising above the jungle canopy and serving as both ceremonial centers and territorial markers visible from great distances. One of these pyramids, known as Structure 2, is among the largest in the entire Maya world. Its layered construction reflects centuries of expansion, with earlier structures encased within later additions. Like many Maya cities, Calakmul was not built in a single phase, but grew through continuous modification, each generation building upon the architectural and symbolic legacy of those who came before. Mainstream archaeology interprets Calakmul as a powerful dynastic capital, ruled by elite families who governed through complex systems of alliance, warfare, and ritual legitimacy. Hieroglyphic inscriptions found at the site reveal references to kings, battles, and political events that connect Calakmul to other major Maya cities across the region. These inscriptions form part of a broader historical narrative in which Calakmul often appears as a central actor in regional power struggles. Yet even with these inscriptions, the full nature of Calakmul's political structure remains partially obscured. The Maya writing system, while extensive, does not always provide continuous historical narratives. Instead, it records selected events, often emphasizing royal achievements, ceremonial dates, and dynastic legitimacy. Large portions of daily life, social organization, and internal decision-making remain outside the written record. The architecture of Calakmul adds another layer of complexity. The city is organized around large plazas, ceremonial platforms, and elevated structures connected by causeways known as sakbiab. These raised roads link different parts of the city, suggesting a carefully planned urban layout designed to facilitate movement, processions, and administrative control. But beyond its structural design, Calakmul presents something more subtle, a sense of scale that resists immediate comprehension. The density of construction within the jungle suggests a city that was not only large, but deeply integrated into its environment. The forest today appears to reclaim the ruins, but in the past, the relationship between city and jungle may have been more fluid, with cleared spaces, managed vegetation, and agricultural systems extending far beyond the central core. How did a city of this magnitude sustain itself within a rainforest environment? Mainstream explanations point to sophisticated agricultural techniques, including raised fields, water management systems, and regional trade networks that allowed the movement of goods such as maize, cacao, salt, and obsidian. Calakmul's power was not solely based on local resources, but on its ability to participate in and control wider exchange systems. Yet even this explanation raises further questions. The ecological balance required to maintain such a large population within a tropical forest environment is complex. How were resources distributed across such a vast region? And how did environmental pressures, such as drought cycles or soil depletion, influence the city's long-term stability? Some researchers suggest that Calakmul's political strength was closely tied to its ability to manage not only resources, but also relationships, forming alliances, influencing smaller centers, and maintaining a network of dependent settlements. In this interpretation, power was not centralized solely within the city walls, but distributed across a wider landscape of interconnected communities. One of the most striking aspects of Calakmul is its rivalry with the city of Tikal. Inscriptions and archaeological evidence indicate repeated conflicts between these two major powers over several centuries. These conflicts were not isolated events, but part of a long-standing geopolitical tension that shaped the political landscape of the Maya lowlands. Yet warfare in the Maya world was not only about territorial control. It was also deeply connected to ritual, ideology, and dynastic legitimacy. Victories were recorded in stone monuments, and captives were often integrated into ceremonial contexts. The boundary between political action and symbolic expression was not always distinct. In Calakmul, carved stelae depict rulers in elaborate regalia, accompanied by glyphic texts that record dates and events. These monuments were not merely historical records, but also instruments of authority, reinforcing the legitimacy of ruling dynasties through visual and textual representation. Still, despite the presence of these inscriptions, large gaps remain in the historical sequence. Entire periods are only partially understood. Some rulers are known only from fragmentary references, while others appear in contexts that are difficult to fully reconstruct. The decline of Calakmul around the 9th century AD forms part of the broader collapse of many classic Maya cities. This period saw widespread political fragmentation, reduced monument construction, and gradual abandonment of major urban centers. The causes of this transition remain complex and likely multifaceted, involving environmental stress, political instability, shifting trade networks, and social transformation. At Calakmul itself, evidence suggests a gradual reduction in monumental activity and eventual decline in population. Yet the site was never completely erased. Even after its political decline, it remained a place of memory, partially occupied and later rediscovered within the forest canopy centuries later. Today, walking through Calakmul is an experience shaped as much by absence as by presence. Massive pyramids rise above the trees, but the surrounding city is largely hidden beneath vegetation. The jungle is not simply a backdrop, it is an active force, reshaping how the ruins are perceived and accessed. The soundscape is equally striking. Instead of urban noise, there is wind through leaves, distant bird calls, and the shifting presence of wildlife moving through structures once inhabited by thousands of people. Stone platforms emerge from the undergrowth, partially covered by roots and moss, as if the city is slowly being reabsorbed into the landscape from which it once emerged. And so Calakmul exists in a state of dual identity, a vast, ancient capital reconstructed through archaeology, and a living forest site where much of the city remains physically hidden from view. It is both known and unknown at the same time. What remains unresolved is not only the historical sequence of events, but the full experience of life within such a vast and interconnected urban system. How did individuals perceive their place within a city of this scale, surrounded by forest, politics, and ritual complexity? And how much of Calakmul's structure still lies beneath the jungle, waiting to reshape our understanding of what this ancient Maya world truly was? From the dense jungle-wrapped silence of Calakmul, where pyramids rise above a sea of green and ancient political rivalries are still etched into stone, the journey shifts once more, this time across oceans, mountains, and cultural worlds. The humid canopy of Mesoamerica gives way to the broad plains and river systems of the Indian subcontinent. Here, in the modern state of Bihar, India, lies what was once one of the greatest centers of learning in human history, the ruins of Nalanda. At first approach, Nalanda does not overwhelm with vertical monumentality in the way of pyramids or citadels. Instead, it unfolds across a wide, open landscape, low red brick foundations stretching across fields, partially reclaimed by earth and grass. The remains appear almost understated at ground level, yet their scale becomes clearer with distance and elevation. What lies beneath is not a single temple or palace, but an entire ancient university city, once alive with scholars, debates, manuscripts, and philosophical inquiry. Nalanda flourished primarily between the 5th century AD and the 12th century AD, reaching its height during the Gupta and post-Gupta periods. It is often described as one of the world's first residential universities, attracting students and scholars from across Asia, including regions that are today parts of Tibet, China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. At its peak, Nalanda was not merely a local institution, but an international center of learning embedded within a vast intellectual network. Historical accounts describe thousands of students and teachers residing within its monastic complexes. Subjects taught ranged across philosophy, logic, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, grammar, and metaphysics. The curriculum was not fixed in the modern sense, but deeply rooted in debate, interpretation, and oral transmission, supported by extensive manuscript libraries. Archaeological excavations have revealed a sprawling complex of monasteries, viharas, temples, stupas, lecture halls, and courtyards arranged in a highly organized architectural layout. The buildings were constructed primarily of red brick, with precise geometric planning. Many monasteries follow a similar design: central courtyards surrounded by cells used for study and meditation, connected by covered corridors and shared facilities. One of the most striking features of Nalanda is the presence of multiple layers of construction, indicating continuous expansion and reconstruction over centuries. New monasteries were built alongside older ones, often following similar architectural principles, but increasing in scale and complexity. This suggests not only sustained institutional continuity, but also evolving educational and religious needs over time. Mainstream historical interpretation views Nalanda as a Buddhist monastic university supported by royal patronage from various dynasties, including the Gupta Empire and later regional rulers. Inscriptions and textual references describe donations of land, resources, and infrastructure to support its functioning. The site was deeply embedded within broader networks of religious and philosophical exchange across Asia. Yet even with this extensive documentation, Nalanda retains aspects that remain open to interpretation. One of the most intriguing features of the site is the sheer sophistication of its intellectual reputation contrasted with the fragmentary survival of its physical knowledge systems. While texts from Nalanda and its scholars influenced traditions across Asia, the physical library structures that once housed vast collections of manuscripts have not survived in their original form. Historical accounts describe enormous libraries containing hundreds of thousands of texts, preserved in multi-story buildings known by names such as Ratnodadi, Ratnasagara, and Ratnaranjaka. These libraries are said to have contained works not only of Buddhist philosophy, but also secular sciences, medical treatises, astronomical calculations, and philosophical debates from multiple traditions. Yet when archaeologists examine the site today, they find only foundations and traces of storage areas, no surviving manuscripts in their original architectural context. This absence raises a quiet but persistent question. How much of Nalanda's intellectual world has been permanently lost, and how much survives indirectly through later transmission? The destruction of Nalanda is often attributed to military invasions in the 12th century AD, particularly associated with campaigns in the region during periods of political instability. Historical accounts describe the burning of libraries and the dispersal of scholars, marking the end of Nalanda as a functioning institution. Whether this destruction was sudden or part of a longer process of decline remains debated, but the symbolic image of lost knowledge has become deeply embedded in historical memory. Archaeologically, evidence of fire damage has been identified in certain structures, supporting accounts of violent disruption. Yet the full sequence of events is difficult to reconstruct with precision. As with many ancient sites, destruction layers provide evidence of collapse, but not always the complete narrative of how that collapse unfolded. Walking through Nalanda today, one moves across a landscape of exposed foundations. The outlines of monasteries are clearly visible, arranged in orderly grids that suggest careful urban planning. Some structures contain remnants of decorative carvings, stone sculptures, and brickwork detailing that hint at the aesthetic and spiritual dimensions of the site. The spatial organization of Nalanda reflects a balance between communal and individual spaces. Lecture halls open into courtyards, while smaller cells suggest areas for solitary study or meditation. The architecture itself seems designed to support both collective learning and individual reflection, reinforcing the intellectual culture for which the site was renowned. Yet despite this clarity in layout, the lived experience of Nalanda remains partially inaccessible. How did daily life unfold within these monastic complexes? What did intellectual debate sound like in spaces where scholars from different regions and traditions gathered? How were disagreements resolved in an environment built on philosophical inquiry? Some interpretations suggest that Nalanda functioned not only as an educational institution, but also as a cosmopolitan hub where ideas were continuously exchanged, refined, and challenged. In this view, the university was not simply a place of instruction, but a dynamic intellectual ecosystem shaped by dialogue across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Others emphasize its role as a religious center, deeply embedded in Buddhist monastic traditions. From this perspective, education and spiritual practice were inseparable, and learning was part of a broader path toward understanding reality and consciousness. Yet these interpretations, while informative, do not fully capture the scale of Nalanda's historical impact. Its influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries, shaping intellectual traditions across Asia long after its decline. Textual traditions linked to Nalanda continued to circulate, translated and adapted into multiple languages and cultural contexts. Even so, the physical site itself remains only partially recovered. Excavations have uncovered only a fraction of the original complex. Large portions of the ancient university likely remain buried beneath surrounding fields, unexcavated or eroded over time. There is also the question of continuity. While Nalanda as an institution ceased to function in its original form, its intellectual legacy did not disappear entirely. Instead, it was transmitted through texts, teachers, and monastic networks that carried its influence into new regions and traditions. This raises an important distinction between the disappearance of a place and the persistence of its ideas. Still, the ruins themselves hold a particular presence. Standing among the foundations, one can trace the outlines of lecture halls, monasteries, and pathways once filled with movement and conversation. The absence of roofs, walls, and living presence creates a space defined as much by what is missing as by what remains. And so, Nalanda becomes not only an archaeological site, but also a question in architectural form. It is a place where knowledge was once structured into physical space, and where that structure now exists primarily as memory embedded in brick and soil. What remains unresolved is not the fact of Nalanda's existence or significance, but the full extent of its intellectual and architectural complexity. How much of its knowledge system can still be reconstructed from fragments? And how much of its true nature, its atmosphere, its rhythms, its intellectual intensity, has been irretrievably lost beneath the layers of time, waiting in silence beneath the fields of Bihar?